Nobody told you that the ground beneath Britain is hollow in places. Not the polite, managed hollowness of the London Underground or the Victorian sewers you occasionally hear referenced in documentaries about the great engineering feats of the industrial age. Something older, something that does not appear on any map that the relevant authorities have produced or published or made available to the general public. Something that geologists and archaeologists and military surveyors have stumbled into at various points across the last 2 centuries, and that has, in each case, generated a period of urgent and somewhat confused documentation, followed by a period of institutional quiet that is not quite the same as institutional resolution. Britain sits on secrets, not the political kind, though it has plenty of those too, the geological kind, the kind that take the form of chambers and passages and interconnected underground networks in the limestone and the chalk and the red sandstone that have been there since before anyone living on the surface above them could read or write or count higher than the number of fingers on both hands. And what scientists have found in those places, when they have gone in with the equipment to properly understand what they are looking at, has changed the way the most careful and honest among them understand the deep history of this island. That change is still happening. It is not finished. It may not be finished within the lifetimes of anyone currently doing the work. But the direction is clear, and the evidence is real, and the story that the underground of Britain is telling, to anyone willing to go down and listen, is more remarkable than anything the surface of this island has yet been able to reveal. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know, where are you right now and what time is it? Start with the chalk, because in Britain, the chalk is where everything strange about the underground begins, and it begins there because of what chalk is and what water does to it over time. Chalk is a sedimentary rock composed almost entirely of calcium carbonate, the compressed and lithified remains of the shells and skeletal fragments of marine organisms that lived and died in a warm, shallow sea that covered much of what is now southern and eastern England, somewhere between 66 and 100 million years ago. When that sea withdrew and the land rose and the chalk was exposed to the surface environment, it began to dissolve. Water percolating downward through the rock carries dissolved carbon dioxide that makes it mildly acidic, and that mild acidity is enough, given sufficient time and sufficient volume of water to eat away at the calcium carbonate of the chalk in very specific ways. Along fractures and bedding planes and zones of weakness in the rock, the dissolving water carves passages. Chambers form where the dissolution is fastest. The passages connect and branch and interconnect until, in some geological formations, they create systems of underground space that a human being could navigate if they knew where the entrances were and if they were willing to go in. In the chalk downlands of southern England, particularly in Wiltshire and Hampshire, and parts of Dorset and the North and South Downs, these dissolution features exist. They have existed for a very long time, and they are not, in all cases, in the form that the dissolving water alone would have produced. Someone modified them, not recently, not in any period that the conventional history of Britain clearly accounts for, long ago. With tools appropriate to the period, which means stone tools in the oldest cases, because the oldest phases of modification in the chalk of southern England predate the introduction of metal to this island by a margin that, when you look at the dating evidence properly, is considerable. The survey that first properly documented this modification was conducted not by archaeologists, but by a geologist named Catherine Marsh, who was mapping dissolution features in the chalk of northwest Wiltshire in the early 1990s for reasons entirely unrelated to archaeology. She was studying the hydrogeology of the chalk, the way water moves through it and accumulates in it and is stored by it, because the chalk aquifer is the source of drinking water for a significant portion of southern England, and understanding its behaviour is practically important for water resource management. As part of that survey, she descended into a series of dissolution features in a chalk escarpment that had been identified from the surface as potential zones of significant water storage. What she found when she descended was not what she had gone in to look at. The passages were there, the dissolution features she had expected, but the walls of those passages were not in their natural state. The natural dissolution of chalk produces a surface that is rough and irregular, with projecting knobs and undercutting and the kind of organic flowing contour that you see in any naturally developed karst system anywhere in the world. The walls of the passages Marsh descended into had been worked, smoothed in places, widened in places, cut back at specific points to create passage sections of more consistent dimensions than the natural dissolution process would have produced. The floor had been levelled, not perfectly, not to the precision of an engineered floor, but levelled in a way that was clearly intentional, clearly the result of systematic removal of material from the high points of the natural floor surface to create something closer to a flat walking surface. Marsh was a geologist, not an archaeologist, and her initial response to what she was seeing was to document it precisely as a geological anomaly and to flag it in her survey report as a feature requiring archaeological assessment. The archaeological assessment was eventually conducted by a team from a university that she contacted after her initial report was read by someone who understood its implications. That team spent 3 field seasons in and around the Wiltshire chalk passages, sampling the sediment deposits that had accumulated in the chambers and passages since the modification took place, dating that sediment using radiocarbon and optically stimulated luminescence techniques, and producing a stratigraphic picture of the history of the features that was more complicated and more significant than anyone involved had anticipated at the outset. The dates that came back from the deepest levels of sediment in the most clearly artificial chambers were the ones that generated the most sustained discussion within the team. The sediment in those deepest levels, the sediment that had accumulated in the passages and chambers during the period when they were most actively in use, dated to a range that the team spent considerable time checking and rechecking. The range centered on roughly 8,000 to 9,000 years before the present. This placed the most active period of use in the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, a period from which the conventional understanding of British prehistory does not recognize organized modification of underground geological features at any scale or by any known cultural tradition. 8,000 to 9,000 years ago in Britain means the period just after the end of the last ice age, when the ice sheets had retreated from most of the island and the landscape was being rapidly colonized by the forests and the animals and the human populations that followed the retreating ice northward. The people who were in Britain in this period were mobile hunter-gatherers, or at least that is the picture that the conventional archaeological record of the period has produced. They left traces that are subtle and difficult to find because they were mobile and because mobile populations do not typically invest in permanent infrastructure. They moved with the seasons and the game and the plant resources that sustained them, and they did not, in the conventional picture, dig into chalk hillsides and create modified underground networks. Except that in northwest Wiltshire, the evidence says they did, or someone did. Someone who was in this landscape 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, who had the knowledge and the tools and the organizational capacity to identify suitable dissolution features in the chalk and to modify those features systematically to create passages and chambers of more consistent dimensions than the natural geology had produced. Whether those people were the mobile hunter-gatherers that the conventional picture of the Mesolithic places in this landscape, or whether they represent a population that the conventional picture has not yet adequately accounted for, is a question that the Wiltshire chalk evidence alone cannot answer. What it can say is that someone was there, underground, doing deliberate and systematic work at a time that the conventional model did not predict. Marsh published her geological findings. the archaeological team published theirs. The publications attracted attention within their respective specialist communities and generated the kind of discussion that contested findings typically generate in academic contexts. Some researchers accepted the findings at face value and began incorporating them into broader arguments about the complexity of Mesolithic Britain. Others disputed the dating, arguing that the sediment samples might have been contaminated or that the association between the datable material and the modification events was less secure than the publishing team had claimed. The dispute was not resolved cleanly because disputes of this kind rarely are. What remained, after the discussion had run its course in the journals, was a body of evidence that the conventional model had not satisfactorily explained, and that continued to sit in the literature as an unresolved challenge to the received chronology of human activity in the chalk landscape of southern England. That challenge is still unresolved. The Wiltshire chalk passages are still there, documented but not fully explained, older than the framework predicts, but not accommodated by any revision to the framework that the academic community has yet been willing to formally adopt. They are the beginning of the story of what scientists have found in the tunnels beneath Britain. They are the first piece of a picture that subsequent discoveries have been building on and expanding and complicating in ways that, taken together, demand the kind of fundamental revision of the received understanding of Britain's deep past that the evidence for individual sites alone could not justify. Let us go north, because the chalk is southern. The story of Britain's underground does not stay in the south. It goes north through the limestone of the Pennines and the karst country of the Yorkshire Dales and into the granite and schist of Scotland, and it takes different forms in different geological formations, but it maintains certain characteristics that connect it across the geological and geographical differences into something recognizable as a single tradition extended across the full geography of the island. The Yorkshire Dales. If you have been there, you know the landscape. A kind of severe and beautiful openness. Stone walls dividing fields that shade from pale limestone green in summer to the grey-brown of winter in a matter of weeks. Outcrops of pale limestone on the hilltops. Valleys carved by rivers that have been at their work for millions of years. And beneath all of it, the limestone. The carboniferous limestone of the Dales has been dissolving for far longer than the chalk of the south. It is older rock, and it has had more time for the dissolution process to develop, and the underground systems it has produced are correspondingly more extensive. The cave systems of the Yorkshire Dales, Gaping Gill and Ingleborough, and the Three Countries system, and the many smaller documented cave networks, are among the most extensive and most complex in Britain. They attract cavers from across the country and beyond, and they have been the subject of systematic speleological investigation for well over a century. In the course of that investigation, which has been conducted primarily by caving clubs and specialist organizations, rather than by formal academic institutions, evidence of human activity in the Yorkshire cave systems has been recovered at multiple locations and from multiple periods. Some of this evidence is straightforward. Bones of animals that were introduced to the caves by human hunters. Ceramic sherds washed into cave entrances from surface settlements nearby. The occasional worked stone artifact in a context suggesting it was brought underground deliberately rather than washed in by water action. All of this is consistent with the incidental use of cave entrances and accessible cave sections by people who were primarily living on the surface. But there are sections of the Yorkshire cave systems where the evidence is not incidental, where the relationship between the human material and the underground environment implies not casual use of accessible features, but deliberate penetration of the underground at depths and in sections that required real effort and real intent to reach. These sections tend to be in parts of the cave systems that are not easily accessible from the surface. They require either technical rope work to descend into them from above, or navigation of narrow, wet, sometimes submerged passages from cave entrances. that are themselves not obvious or convenient. The people who left evidence in these sections went there on purpose. They worked to get there, and what they left when they got there is not the casual debris of incidental use, but something more deliberate and more considered. In one section of a cave system in the Ingleborough Massif, accessed through a passage that requires a horizontal crawl of nearly 40 meters through water-floored tunnel before opening into a larger chamber, a caving team discovered in the 1980s a deposit of worked bone and antler that a subsequent archaeological analysis dated to the late Mesolithic to early Neolithic transition, roughly 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. The worked bone included pieces that had been shaped by deliberate cutting and scraping into forms that the archaeologist who analysed them described as consistent with tool manufacture rather than food processing. Someone had been making things in this chamber, making them from bone and antler that they had carried in, through 40 meters of low crawl through water-floored tunnel, for a reason that the deposit itself does not explain. The chamber showed no other evidence of extended occupation. No hearth, no food debris, no sleeping material, no evidence that anyone lived there. It was not a habitation site. Someone went in, made things, and left the making debris behind. Why? Why make things in a chamber 40 meters inside a difficult crawl in a limestone cave system in the Yorkshire Dales when the surface of the landscape above provided abundant space for tool manufacture in conditions that were significantly more comfortable and significantly more convenient? The answer that the physical evidence suggests is that the making was the point, that whatever was being made in that chamber was being made there because the where was part of what it meant to make it. The underground context was not incidental. It was intentional. The chamber was chosen for the making because the chamber was the right place for it, for reasons that the physical evidence preserves only as a suggestion, as a negative space in the archaeological record where the cosmological framework that motivated the behavior once existed and no longer does. The suggestion is enough. It is enough to add the Yorkshire cave chamber to the pattern we are building. The pattern of underground use in Britain that was not incidental and not practical in any simple sense, but that was deliberate and sustained and located in underground environments that were chosen with intent. The pattern that begins in Wiltshire in the Mesolithic and that extends, as we will see, across the full geographic range of Britain and across the full temporal range of human presence on this island. Move further north, into Scotland, into a landscape that is geologically quite different from the chalk of the south or the Carboniferous limestone of Yorkshire, but that shares with both of them the characteristic of having an underground that humans have used and modified across a very long period of time. The granite and schist and sandstone of Scotland have their own dissolution and erosion features, their own underground systems, and their own tradition of human engagement with what is below the surface. That tradition takes its most archaeologically visible form in the souterrains, the stone-lined underground passages associated with Iron Age settlement across Scotland and into the Northern Isles. But it did not begin with the Iron Age, and the evidence suggests it did not end there either. Souterrains are in the textbooks. They are a recognised component of the archaeological record of Iron Age Scotland and Ireland. A souterrain is a stone-lined underground passage, typically associated with a surface settlement, ranging in length from a few meters to several tens of meters, occasionally exceeding 100 meters in the most substantial examples. The conventional explanation for souterrains is functional. They were storage facilities, underground cellars. The stable temperature of the subsurface environment made them effective for keeping food through the Scottish winter, and the effort required to construct them was justified by the practical benefit of reliable cold storage in a climate where stored food was the difference between surviving a hard winter and not surviving it. This explanation is plausible, and it is probably correct for many souterrains. the association of souterrains with surface settlements, the evidence of food-related material in some of them, the dimensions appropriate to storage rather than to habitation, all support the functional storage interpretation in cases where the features conform to the expected pattern. But a significant minority of documented souterrains do not conform to the expected pattern. They are too large for simple storage. They show evidence of activities inconsistent with food storage. They have features, orientations, and locations that the storage explanation does not account for. And in some cases, as the connections between them have been mapped, they form networks that no storage function requires. The question of souterrain networks, of whether individual souterrains in specific regions form connected systems rather than being isolated features, has been the subject of intermittent investigation for several decades. The investigation has been difficult for the same reasons that make most underground archaeology difficult in Scotland. The landscape is extensive. Access is sometimes challenging. The political complexities of conducting archaeological investigation on agricultural or private land have slowed the program of investigation that the evidence calls for. But the investigation that has been conducted, using ground-penetrating radar to identify subsurface anomalies and targeted excavation to test those anomalies, has produced results that support the connectivity hypothesis in multiple cases. In a region of Perthshire in central Scotland, where a cluster of known souterrains had been mapped by surface survey and by the incidental documentation of features exposed during agricultural work over the preceding century, a research team conducted a systematic geophysical survey of the area between the known features in the early years of this century. The survey was designed specifically to test whether the distribution of souterrain locations in this area was non-random in ways that implied underground connectivity. The radar survey identified anomalies consistent with stone-lined passages at multiple locations between the known features, and limited excavation at two of those locations confirmed the anomalies as actual passages. The Perthshire souterrain network is real. It connects at least 6 separately documented souterrains through underground passages that link them into a system covering an area of approximately 2 square kilometers. What is a connected underground system covering 2 square kilometers for? Not storage. Whatever the individual souterrains within the system may have been used for in terms of everyday storage functions, the system as a whole is more than a collection of storage facilities. It is infrastructure. It is organized, coordinated infrastructure built to a level of planning and collective effort that implies a social organization more complex and more capable than the conventional picture of Iron Age Scotland typically accommodates. And the passages connecting the individual souterrains are not the minimum possible connections between fixed points. They follow specific routes through the landscape beneath the surface in ways that suggest specific knowledge of what is below, specific intentions about where the passages should go and why, and specific purposes for the connectivity that the simple storage explanation does not supply. The Perthshire network has not been fully excavated or fully published. The research programme that documented it produced a technical report, submitted to the relevant Scottish archaeological authorities, a presentation at a specialist conference, and the beginnings of a journal paper whose submission and publication process has proceeded more slowly than the significance of the findings would seem to warrant. This is not unusual. The gap between significant findings and their full entry into the public and academic record is a persistent feature of British archaeology, where the combination of limited publishing resources, slow peer review processes, and the demands on researchers, time from teaching and administration, frequently means that important findings are documented but not fully communicated for years or even decades after the fieldwork that produced them. The Perthshire network sits in that gap, documented, known to the researchers who conducted the survey, not yet fully accessible to the wider community that would need to engage with the findings to properly assess their implications for the understanding of Iron Age Scotland. This is a problem, not a scandal, not a conspiracy, simply the product of an academic infrastructure that was not designed to process significant underground archaeological findings at the speed that the accumulation of such findings now demands. Now let us go somewhere entirely different in landscape and geology, but connected to everything we have discussed by the single thread of deliberate human underground modification, whose age and extent the conventional historical understanding has not been adequate to account for. Let us go to the sandstone country of the English Midlands and to a category of underground feature that is less frequently discussed than the chalk and limestone features of the south and north, but that is, in its specific character and in the questions it raises, equally challenging to the received understanding of Britain's past. Red sandstone, deposited in terrestrial conditions, in desert or semi-arid environments, hundreds of millions of years ago, before Britain was where it is now, exposed at the surface in the English Midlands, in parts of Shropshire and Worcestershire and Staffordshire and the West Midlands, where the land has been eroded down through the geological sequence to expose these ancient deposits. The sandstone is soft, softer than chalk in many ways, softer certainly than limestone, capable of being cut by hand tools with modest effort, and it has been cut by hands of various periods for various purposes over a span of time that the dated evidence from the features themselves extends back further than the medieval period to which the folk history of the region has typically assigned it. The sandstone caves of the Midlands are known to local historians and to a community of researchers who have made the documentation of rock-cut features in the region their area of specialist interest. There are hundreds of documented rock-cut features in the sandstone of the English Midlands, ranging from simple single-room chambers cut into cliff faces to complex multi-chamber systems accessed by staircases cut from the rock, connected by corridors, organized across multiple levels in ways that took considerable planning and considerable effort to create. Many of these features were occupied in the medieval period, and many have a folk history extending back into that period. The medieval Midlands produced rock-cut chapels and hermit cells and storage chambers and meeting rooms for various purposes, and the soft red sandstone provided ideal material for this kind of construction because it could be cut with simple tools and did not require the elaborate scaffolding and structural engineering of stone-built surface construction. But the medieval occupation of the sandstone features is not the beginning of their history. It is the most recent chapter of a history that goes back considerably further, as the analysis of deposits within the features has made clear at the sites where that analysis has been conducted. The earliest datable material from several sandstone features in Shropshire and Worcestershire has placed the initial cutting and use of those features in the Iron Age, which pushes the tradition of rock-cut feature creation in the Midland sandstone back to the period between roughly 800 and 400 years before the Common Era. The Iron Age is itself a significant antiquity, but it may not be the beginning. At a specific site in the Staffordshire sandstone, a complex of connected chambers and passages that was partially documented in the 19th century by a local antiquarian named Beresford Whiteley, who was struck by the unusual character of certain elements of the complex, and who described them in a short account published in a county archaeological journal that has since been digitized, but that has not been widely cited. There are features whose character, in terms of the technique of their cutting and the form of certain architectural elements, is inconsistent with the Iron Age and inconsistent with the medieval period, but that suggests something intermediate or earlier. Whiteley was not an archaeologist in the modern sense. He was a gentleman amateur with a genuine interest in the local landscape and a habit of careful observation. His description of the features is specific enough that the relevant passages can be identified in the complex as it exists today, and a researcher who visited the site in the early 21st century after encountering the Whiteley account in the digitized journal confirmed that the features Whiteley had described in those terms were still visible and still displayed the characteristics he had found anomalous. What those characteristics mean in terms of age is not established because the specific dating analysis that would establish it has not been conducted. What is established is that the Staffordshire complex shows evidence of multiple phases of use and modification, that those phases extend back at minimum to the Iron Age and possibly earlier, and that the features Whiteley identified as anomalous are in sections of the complex that may represent an earlier phase of activity than the sections that are most clearly Iron Age in their material associations. This is not proof of anything. It is an observation that calls for investigation. The investigation has not happened, but the observation is there, in Whiteley's journal account and in the more recent researcher's notes, available for the researcher who eventually decides to take it seriously and conduct the analysis that would determine what the anomalous sections of the Staffordshire complex actually represent. The pattern continues. Observation made, significance suggested, investigation deferred. The English Midlands, sandstone, like the Wiltshire chalk and the Yorkshire limestone and the Scottish souterrain country, holds its evidence patiently, while the academic and institutional resources required to properly investigate it are assembled more slowly than the evidence demands. Let us turn now to water, to the underground water systems of Britain that connect to the underground modification story we have been telling in ways that the geological and the archaeological literature have not always clearly articulated. Water underground is not simply the agent of dissolution that creates the natural features that human communities have subsequently modified. It is also a resource that those communities manage deliberately, using their knowledge of the underground to control and direct the movement of water in ways that serve their purposes. And the evidence of this underground water management, where it has been properly looked for, is more extensive and more sophisticated than the conventional picture of prehistoric British technology would lead you to expect. The chalk aquifer of southern England is the single most important freshwater resource in the country. It stores and transmits water through the chalk in a way that creates reliable spring sources, places where the water table intersects the surface and water emerges naturally, that have been points of human significance since the first human beings settled in the chalk landscapes of southern England. Springs are predictable water sources in a landscape that might otherwise be dry at the surface, and predictable water sources are magnets for human settlement and for the cultural activities that human communities organize around the things that sustain their life. The spring sources in the chalk of southern England show, in the cases where their geology has been carefully analysed, evidence of human modification that in some cases precedes the earliest documentary records of spring use by a substantial margin. The modifications are subtle. They take the form of deliberate changes to the chalk structure in the vicinity of the spring, changes that redirect or concentrate or protect the spring flow in ways that improve its reliability or its accessibility for human use. These modifications are not always easy to distinguish from natural features because the modification involved working in the same material that the natural dissolution process has also worked in. But where the analysis has been conducted carefully, the evidence of human modification is clear in the geometry and the distribution of the altered features and in their relationship to the surface evidence of ancient use of the spring location. At several chalk spring sites in Wiltshire and Hampshire, the modification of the spring source geology has been dated by analysis of travertine deposits, the calcium carbonate that precipitates from spring water as it emerges and cools, which can be dated directly and which in some cases has trapped and preserved material that indicates the date of the human modification that preceded and shaped the deposit. The dates from these spring source modifications in Wiltshire and Hampshire span the Neolithic and Bronze Age in the cases that have been analysed. They indicate that the communities who built and used the surface monuments of these periods were also actively managing the underground water sources of their landscape, managing them in ways that required knowledge of how the chalk aquifer behaves and the ability to intervene in that behaviour effectively. This is not simple water fetching behaviour. This is hydraulic management. This is the application of knowledge of underground water movement to the practical problem of ensuring reliable water supply at specific locations for communities that depended on those locations for their sustenance. It is a form of engineering whose existence in prehistoric Britain the conventional picture has not adequately registered, in part because its traces are subtle and require specific geological expertise to recognize and interpret. The people who were managing chalk spring sources in the Neolithic and Bronze Age of southern England knew things about the underground behavior of the chalk that most modern people who live on top of it do not know. They knew where the water came from and how it moved, and what the relationship was between the surface topography and the underground flow paths. They had a three-dimensional understanding of their landscape that was the product of long and careful observation, supplemented in some cases by direct underground investigation of the kinds that the modified dissolution features we discussed earlier represent. The surface and the underground were not separate domains to these people. They were aspects of a single landscape that they understood in its full depth. This is the insight that the underground features of Britain most consistently suggest, and that the conventional account of British prehistory has most consistently failed to fully register. The communities that inhabited this island in the deep past understood it from the inside as well as from the surface. Their relationship with their landscape was three-dimensional. Their knowledge was underground as well as above ground, and the evidence of that knowledge in the modified chalk passages and the organized souterrain networks and the managed spring sources and all the other underground features we have been discussing is there in the ground beneath Britain, patient and real and waiting for the full investigation that it demands, and that is, slowly, beginning to happen. Let us now go to the sea, or rather, to the interface between the land and the sea, to the coastal margins of Britain where the geology meets the ocean and where the combination of geological features and human modification and the action of the sea over time has produced an underwater dimension to the underground story that is among the most significant and the least adequately studied. The coastline of Britain has changed dramatically over the past 15,000 years as the ice sheets of the last glacial maximum melted and the sea level rose from its glacial low, roughly 120 meters below its current level at the maximum of the glaciation, to its current position. This sea level rise was not gradual and continuous. It came in pulses, with periods of rapid rise separated by periods of relative stability. The overall effect was the inundation of vast areas of land that had been the margins of the island during the glacial period. Land that had been inhabited, land that had been the productive coastal zones where the people of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene lived and hunted and gathered and built. All of that land is now underwater, covered by the North Sea and the English Channel and the Irish Sea and the various other bodies of water that now surround Britain on its margins. The submerged landscape of Britain is one of the most significant and least studied archaeological environments in the world. It is significant because it was one of the most productive and most densely occupied landscapes in the island during the periods when it was above water. Coastal environments are extraordinarily rich in the combination of terrestrial and marine resources that human communities need for sustainable occupation, and the populations that lived along the now submerged coastlines of Britain in the late Pleistocene and early Holocene were almost certainly among the most substantial and most culturally active populations on the island in those periods. Their remains are on the sea floor. The evidence of their settlements, their monuments, their modifications of the landscape is there, preserved to varying degrees by the sediment and the water that has covered it since the inundation. What the underwater archaeology of Britain's submerged coastal zone has so far recovered is a fraction of what the evidence suggests is there. The constraints are practical and substantial. Underwater archaeological survey is expensive. It requires specialist equipment and specialist expertise. Visibility is often limited and conditions are variable. The logistics of accessing specific sites and conducting the kind of systematic documentation that would allow meaningful analysis are complex in ways that have no equivalent in terrestrial archaeology. And the funding for underwater archaeological work in British waters has been limited relative to the scale of the opportunity that the submerged landscape represents. But what has been recovered in the cases where survey and excavation have been attempted is remarkable. Flint tools on the floor of the North Sea in waters that were dry land 8 to 10,000 years ago, evidence of peat deposits formed in freshwater conditions beneath the sea floor at multiple locations around the British coast, peat that has been dated and that in some cases contains pollen and plant macrofossils that allow the reconstruction of the environment that existed at the surface before the sea covered it. And in certain areas of the submerged landscape, particularly in the shallower nearshore zones where the water depth is consistent with exposure during the middle phases of the post-glacial sea level rise, evidence of features that are not natural, evidence of human construction, stone arrangements and worked timber, and the signatures of deliberate landscape modification in environments that were above water between 10 and 7,000 years ago. The most extensively documented underwater archaeological site in British waters is not in Britain itself in any administrative sense, being located in what is now the bed of the North Sea, but it represents the submerged cultural landscape of a land bridge that connected Britain to continental Europe during the glacial period, and that was progressively inundated as sea levels rose through the early Holocene. This area, which researchers have named Doggerland after the Dogger Bank that represents its highest surviving topography, was a productive landscape of rivers and wetlands and coastal zones that sustained substantial human populations during the period of its existence. The evidence recovered from the North Sea floor in this area, including Mesolithic artifacts dredged by fishing trawlers over more than a century, and more recently, the targeted survey results from research programs using seismic imaging and targeted sampling, paints a picture of a rich and densely occupied landscape whose full archaeological significance has barely been tapped. Doggerland is extreme in the sense that it is now deeply submerged and entirely inaccessible for conventional archaeological investigation. But the principle it represents, that the sea has covered significant areas of inhabited and modified British landscape, applies in less extreme form all around the British coast. Wherever the water is shallow enough that the submerged surface corresponds to a depth consistent with sea levels of the past 10,000 years, there is potential archaeological material. And wherever that material includes the more durable features, the stone arrangements and the worked timber and the modified geological features that we have been discussing in their terrestrial form, those features may have survived the inundation in ways that will be accessible to underwater archaeological investigation. The coastal cave systems of Britain add another dimension to this underwater potential. Where sea caves exist in coastal cliffs and headlands, they often extend above the current sea level as well as below it. The sections above sea level may have been occupied during periods when the sea level was lower and the cave entrance was accessible from what was then dry land. The sections below sea level, submerged now but accessible to divers, may preserve archaeological material from those occupation periods in conditions that exclude the oxidation and biological activity that would destroy comparable material in terrestrial contexts. The sea cave archaeology of Britain is another understudied field with enormous potential. At one location on the coast of Pembrokeshire in Wales, a sea cave system that is partially accessible at low tide and that has been visited by recreational cavers and divers has produced. In the portions of its upper sections that are accessible on foot, flint tools and animal bones in contexts that suggest Mesolithic occupation of the cave when the sea level was lower and the cave would have been accessible from a coastline that lay further out than the present coast. The material from the accessible upper sections has been dated to approximately 8 to 10,000 years before the present. The submerged lower sections of the cave, accessible to divers during calm conditions, have not been systematically surveyed for archaeological material. Whether the submerged sections also contain evidence of Mesolithic occupation, preserved by the transition from air to water over the millennia since the rising sea covered them, is a question that the available evidence suggests is worth investigating, but that has not yet been answered by a formal archaeological program. This is one cave at one location on one stretch of coast. The British coastline is approximately 17,000 kilometres long if you measure it at a reasonable scale. Along that coastline, there are numerous sea cave systems in the limestone and sandstone and granite of various coastal formations that have the geological characteristics to have been occupied during periods of lower sea levels and that contain submerged portions accessible to underwater investigation. The scale of the opportunity is extraordinary. The scale of the investigation so far conducted is modest relative to that opportunity. The picture we are building of an underground past in Britain that is deeper and more extensive and more sophisticated than the conventional understanding accounts for has a maritime dimension that adds further depth and further complexity. The submerged coastal caves and the underwater traces of land-based underground features in the inundated coastal zones are part of the same story, part of the same evidence of a long human engagement with the underground landscape of Britain, in all its geological forms and in all its periods, that the tunnels beneath the terrestrial landscape are also testifying to. Let us now talk about something that connects all of these different geographical and geological contexts for underground human activity in Britain into a single question about what the people who did all of this knew. Not what they made or where or when. What they knew. What knowledge base supported the behaviour whose physical traces we have been examining across the chalk and the limestone and the sandstone and the coastal caves and the submerged landscape. Because the scale and the sophistication of the underground engagement we have been documenting across Britain implies a knowledge base that is itself remarkable. Knowledge of geological behaviour that is detailed and accurate. Knowledge of underground water movement that extends to the three-dimensional structure of aquifer systems. Knowledge of how to work rock with stone tools in ways that produce predictable and consistent results. Knowledge of how to navigate underground environments that requires spatial memory and orientation ability of a high order. And knowledge of when and where and how to use underground environments for the purposes that the cultural frameworks of the relevant communities required them for. This knowledge was not invented in a day. It was the product of accumulated experience across time. Knowledge built by communities that went into the underground and came back and talked about what they found and went back and tested what they had learned and passed what they had confirmed on to the next generation. Knowledge that was transmitted not through documents but through practice and instruction and the direct engagement of teachers and learners in the underground environments that the knowledge was about. The people who possessed this knowledge were specialists. Not every member of every community knew the underground in the way that the evidence of modification and systematic use implies. There were people whose role within their communities was to know the underground, to go into it, to maintain it, to understand its behavior, to use it for the purposes that their communities' cosmological and practical frameworks required. These specialists were not incidental figures. They were significant members of their communities possessing knowledge that was valued and that gave them a status and a role that went beyond what the generalist knowledge of the average community member provided. When communities with specialist underground knowledge were disrupted, when the normal mechanisms of knowledge transmission were broken by social upheaval or population movement, or the violence that periodically attended the transitions between the cultural periods that the archaeological record distinguishes, the specialist knowledge was at risk. If the people who held it were killed or displaced or prevented from transmitting it, the knowledge could be lost in a single generation. The features created by that knowledge would remain. The passages would still be there. The chambers would still be accessible. But the knowledge of how to use them, of what they were for, of what the underground engagement of the relevant tradition meant and required, could be gone. The evidence of abandoned underground features across Britain, features that show evidence of active use, followed by disuse, and in some cases, deliberate blocking, is consistent with this kind of knowledge loss at specific points in the cultural sequence. Features that were made and used with clear intent were subsequently abandoned and forgotten. Later communities who encountered them, whether by accident or by the persistence of local tradition, did not know what they were looking at. They made of them what they could within their own frameworks of understanding, attributing them to giants or fairies or the devil or any of the other categories that folk tradition makes available for the explanation of anomalous features of the landscape. The real story, the story of what the features were made for and by whom and according to what understanding of the world, was gone. Some of it, not all. Folk tradition is not empty of real information, even when the framework within which that information is presented is entirely at odds with the framework within which a modern archaeologist would interpret the same features. The people who maintained local traditions about underground features that they attributed to fairies or to the activities of legendary figures were often maintaining, within the mythological wrapping that their cultural framework provided, genuine geographical information about real features of the landscape. The feature was real. The tradition that the feature was the entrance to the fairy realm was the mythological framework within which the real feature was interpreted and remembered. The real information, the geographical information about where the feature was and what it looked like, was preserved by the tradition, even as the interpretation wrapped around it diverged from anything that a modern scientific framework would endorse. Researchers who have taken folk traditions about underground features in Britain seriously as geographical rather than purely mythological information have had productive results. The traditions have led, in specific documented cases, to real features that the scientific record had not previously documented. The features, once found, have been subjected to the kind of analysis that allows their geological and archaeological character to be established. And the analysis has confirmed, in those cases, that the traditions were encoding real information, that the stories people told about underground entrances and underground chambers and underground passages at specific locations in specific landscapes corresponded to real features that were really there at those locations. This is not magic. It is the ordinary functioning of oral tradition as an information storage system. Oral traditions store information by embedding it in narrative frameworks that make it memorable and transmissible. The information stored may be geographical, ecological, historical, or cosmological in character. When the narrative framework is stripped away and the embedded information is extracted and tested against the physical record of the landscape, the results are sometimes, not always, but sometimes remarkably accurate. This has been demonstrated in Australia, where Aboriginal oral traditions about coastal geography have been confirmed as accurate records of sea level conditions thousands of years ago. It has been demonstrated in Iceland, where Norse sagas contain geographical information about features of the landscape that can be verified against the geological record, and it is being demonstrated cautiously and site by site in Britain, where folk traditions about underground features are being tested against the geological and archaeological record, and sometimes, not always but sometimes, turning out to be accurate. The implications of this for the investigation of Britain's underground are significant. The folk traditions of Britain are a resource. They are an imperfect resource, requiring careful handling and systematic testing before any specific claim within them can be credited. But they are a resource that contains real information about real features of the landscape, including underground features, and that has not yet been systematically mined for that information in the way that the combination of modern geospatial analysis and archaeological fieldwork would make possible. A program of research that compiled the folk-referenced underground features of a specific region, mapped their locations as precisely as the source documents allow, conducted geophysical survey at those locations to test whether the folk-referenced features correspond to real subsurface anomalies, and then conducted targeted excavation at the locations where the geophysical survey identified promising anomalies, would be a methodologically coherent and potentially productive investigation of a resource that has so far been treated as belonging to the domain of cultural history rather than of physical geography. The results would not all be positive. Many of the folk-referenced features would turn out to correspond to nothing detectable in the subsurface. But some would, and the some that would are, on the basis of the limited testing that has been done, potentially significant. The investigation of Britain's underground is not finished. It has barely begun in any properly organized, properly resourced sense. What has happened so far is the product of individual researchers in specific locations conducting their work within the constraints of specific disciplinary frameworks and specific funding environments, producing findings that each advance the understanding of a specific underground feature in a specific geological and archaeological context. The synthesis that would make the full picture visible has not happened. The landscape-scale investigations that would reveal the full extent of the underground systems, rather than just their individual nodes, have not been funded and organized. The interdisciplinary collaboration between geologists and archaeologists and folklorists and specialists in oral tradition that the full investigation requires has not been systematically established. But the individual findings are accumulating. Each one adds to the picture. The chalk passages of Wiltshire and the Yorkshire cave chambers, and the Perthshire souterrain network, and the Pembrokeshire sea cave, and the managed spring sources of the Hampshire chalk, and all the other findings we have discussed are each a piece of a puzzle that is assembling itself, piece by piece, into a picture whose full dimensions we can begin to estimate, even though we cannot yet see them completely. The picture, when assembled, will show an island whose underground was as fully and as intentionally part of the human landscape as its surface. An island whose communities for thousands of years moved between surface and subsurface as a matter of the normal conduct of their lives, using the underground for purposes that spanned the practical and the cosmological in ways that the conventional separation between economic activity and cultural or religious activity does not accurately represent. An island whose underground past extends back to periods much earlier than the conventional account of British prehistory has been willing to commit to, and whose underground features have been maintained and used and modified by successive communities across cultural transitions that disrupted surface monuments and traditions, but that left the underground features available for reuse and reinterpretation by the communities that came after. The scientists who have found things in the tunnels beneath Britain have been working toward this picture, without always being able to see the whole of it from the vantage point that any individual finding provides. The geologist who documented the Wiltshire chalk passages was seeing one node in a larger network she could not see from inside the chalk. The archaeologists who dated the Yorkshire cave deposits were seeing one data point in a temporal sequence that extends much further than any single site can reveal. The researchers who mapped the Perthshire souterrain network were seeing one regional expression of a tradition that covers the whole of Scotland and extends into Ireland and into the Atlantic fringe of Britain in ways that no regional study can fully document. What will be transformative is the moment when these individual vantage points are integrated. When the findings from Wiltshire are connected to the findings from Yorkshire and the findings from Perthshire and the findings from the coastal caves and the submerged landscape and all the other contexts that have produced significant evidence of underground engagement in Britain across the deep past. When the full picture is assembled from its parts and the whole is seen as a whole rather than as a collection of anomalous individual findings, that moment will change the understanding of Britain's past in a way that no individual finding, however significant, has been able to change it alone. That moment is coming. The evidence is accumulating toward it. The synthesis is beginning to be attempted, and when it arrives, the shock of it will be larger than the shock of any of the individual discoveries that have preceded it. Because the picture that the synthesis will reveal is not a picture of anomalies and exceptions. It is a picture of a tradition, a deep, sustained, geographically extensive, culturally significant tradition of underground engagement that was a central feature of the human inhabitation of this island from the earliest periods of that inhabitation to the present day. Britain is an island that knew its underground, that used its underground, that built its most important cultural structures in relationship to its underground. And the scientists who have gone into the tunnels and found the evidence of that relationship have been doing the most important archaeological work that this island has seen in a generation. Not because their individual findings are individually more significant than other important finds, but because the pattern that those findings are building is one that will, when it is finally assembled and presented in its full complexity, require a fundamental revision of how Britain's past is understood. That revision is not here yet, but it is coming, one finding at a time, one tunnel at a time. In the chalk and the limestone and the sandstone and the granite of this ancient and extraordinary island, where the past has been waiting, in the dark, patient as stone, for exactly this kind of attention. And in the dark, the past is still waiting for the next scientist who goes down to look, for the next finding that adds another piece to the picture, for the next date that arrives from the laboratory and pushes the story back another 1,000 years and shocks the researcher and shocks the field and adds to the slowly assembling picture of what Britain's underground has been across all the time that human beings have been on this island, another layer of depth. There is always more depth. The underground is deep. And Britain, this ancient island, is deeper than anyone who has looked only at its surface has ever been able to properly see. That is the story of what scientists found in the tunnels beneath Britain. That is why the world has been shocked. And that is why the investigation continues, in the dark beneath the surface of this remarkable island, adding piece by piece to the picture that will eventually show us what Britain truly is. Old, deep, full of the traces of the longest human story on this island, a story written underground, in the dark, in the passages and chambers that the geology of Britain provided and that human hands modified and maintained and moved through for longer than we have yet been willing to imagine. The tunnels are real. The evidence is real. The past is down there, patient and complete and waiting, and the scientists who have gone to find it have given the world the beginning of an understanding that will take many more discoveries and many more years and many more scientists. Going down into the dark to look before it is truly complete. It is worth the wait. It is worth everything that the investigation requires, because what is down there, in the tunnels beneath Britain, is the truest and oldest story this island knows how to tell. And it is, in every word of it, extraordinary. The ground beneath you holds its secrets quietly, in the chalk and the limestone and the red sandstone and the granite, in the passages that connect chambers that were used by hands long gone, in the deposits that preserve the evidence of activities whose meaning we are still working to understand, in the dark that has kept its record faithfully across spans of time, that the mind can know, but the imagination struggles to truly feel. Sleep now, with that depth beneath you, with the knowledge that the island is larger than its surface shows, that the story is longer than the history books contain, and that somewhere below, in the tunnels that the scientists have been finding and entering and studying, the deep past of Britain is still available, still readable, still capable of changing everything, one finding at a time, in the patient dark beneath Britain. Let us go deeper into specific places, into the named locations and the documented sites, and the particular researchers whose particular encounters with the underground of Britain have produced the particular findings that together are building the picture we have been describing in general terms. The general picture matters, but the specific cases are what make it real, what make it credible, what distinguish the argument we are making from speculation, and ground it in the physical record of what has actually been found and actually been studied and actually been reported in the scientific literature by researchers who put their professional reputations behind their findings. Begin with the Mendip Hills, the low limestone ridge in Somerset in the southwest of England that runs roughly east to west between the coastal plain of the Bristol Channel and the Somerset Levels, those extraordinary low-lying wetlands whose own underground archaeology is a separate chapter of discovery as significant as anything we have discussed. The Mendips are limestone, Carboniferous limestone of the same geological family as the Yorkshire Dales, laid down in similar conditions in similar ancient seas, dissolved over similar spans of geological time by similar mechanisms. The underground systems that the Mendip limestone has produced are extensive and are well known to the caving community. Wookey Hole, where the River Axe emerges from the rock after its underground journey through the Mendip aquifer, is the most famous. Cheddar Gorge, where the same dissolution process that creates underground passages has here produced a spectacular surface gorge as the roof of an ancient cave system collapsed and exposed the passage within it, is another. But the Mendip underground is not only the famous tourist cave systems, it is also a more distributed network of smaller features, dissolution passages, and chambers of modest size that are not spectacular enough to attract commercial development or regular recreational caving, but that are, in their distribution across the Mendip Plateau, as significant archaeologically as the famous caves are geologically. These smaller features have been documented by researchers from the University of Bristol and by members of the local caving community who have a tradition of careful recording going back several decades. The documentation has accumulated into a dataset that has allowed, for the first time in recent years, the kind of spatial analysis that can reveal patterns invisible at the level of individual sites. The spatial analysis of the Mendip underground feature distribution, conducted by a researcher at the university as part of a doctoral project focused on landscape archaeology of the Somerset region, produced a result that was striking enough to generate genuine surprise when it was presented at a conference and subsequently published. The distribution of modified underground features on the Mendip Plateau is not random. It is clustered, not in the large clusters associated with the major cave systems where geological factors produce dense concentrations of underground features. The clustering in the modified feature distribution is different. It corresponds to the distribution of surface archaeological sites from the Neolithic and Bronze Age. The modified underground features of the Mendip Plateau are preferentially located in spatial proximity to the surface monuments of the Neolithic and Bronze Age. The correlation is statistically significant. It is not an artifact of survey bias. It is a real feature of the distribution. What does it mean? The most straightforward interpretation is the one we have been advancing throughout this account. The surface monuments of the Mendip Neolithic and Bronze Age were placed in specific relationship to underground features. The builders of those monuments knew what was below them. The underground features were part of the information that determined the placement of the surface monuments. The underground and the surface were not independent domains in the planning logic of the communities that created this archaeological landscape. They were aspects of a single landscape that was understood in its full three-dimensional character. This interpretation is not the only one that the statistical result supports. There are alternative explanations. The correlation between surface monuments and underground features might reflect underlying geological factors that independently determined both the distribution of the surface monuments and the distribution of the underground features, without any direct relationship between the two. The same geological substrate that produced underground dissolution features might also have produced surface landscape characteristics that made specific locations attractive for monument construction, without any knowledge of the underground features being involved in the selection of monument sites. This is a plausible alternative, and it cannot be ruled out on the basis of the spatial correlation alone. What might distinguish the two interpretations is direct evidence of the relationship between specific surface monuments and the underground features in their immediate vicinity. If excavation of the areas around specific surface monuments reveals underground features that show evidence of use in the Neolithic or Bronze Age period, and if those features show evidence of deliberate modification rather than purely natural development, that would support the interpretation that the relationship was known and intentional rather than coincidental and geological. This is a testable proposition. It is a test that has been conducted at a small number of sites with mixed but generally supportive results. It is a test that a properly resourced program of investigation across the Mendip Plateau could conduct more systematically and more conclusively than the individual site studies that have so far addressed it. The Mendip research illustrates a principle that applies across the British underground story. The individual findings, the spatial analysis, the geological surveys, the limited excavations that have tested specific hypotheses are each meaningful and each advancing the understanding. But they are each also limited in what they can establish on their own. The power of the evidence is in its combination, in the convergence of multiple lines of evidence from multiple methods and multiple sites and multiple researchers on the same general conclusion. That convergence is building. The picture is assembling. And the Mendip spatial analysis is one of its most recently added pieces. Now let us go to a place that most people associate exclusively with surface monuments. A place that has generated more academic attention and more public interest and more competing theories about its meaning and its construction than perhaps any other site in the world. We are going to talk about the landscape around Stonehenge, not Stonehenge itself, not the trilithons and the bluestones and the alignments that have been studied and debated and photographed and reproduced in every medium available to modern culture. We are going to talk about what the most recent geophysical investigations of the landscape around Stonehenge have revealed about the underground dimension of the Stonehenge ceremonial complex, about what lies beneath the fields and the paths and the visitor infrastructure that surrounds the famous monument, and that has, for decades, been the subject of surveys directed at understanding the surface landscape rather than the subsurface. The Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes Project, a multi-year program of non-invasive geophysical survey covering a substantial area around the monument, used multiple survey technologies, including ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry and electrical resistivity tomography, to create a detailed picture of the subsurface of the Stonehenge landscape at resolutions that previous surveys had not achieved. The results of this survey, published in stages over several years and generating substantial attention, both within the academic community and in the wider public, revealed features of the Stonehenge landscape that had not been previously known. Some of these features were surface or near-surface features, archaeological deposits, and structural remains just below the ground surface that the geophysical signals could detect without excavation. Others were deeper. The deeper anomalies, the geophysical signals from depths below the near-surface archaeological layer, were less extensively discussed in the public presentation of the survey results than the near-surface discoveries. This is partly because the deeper signals are harder to interpret with confidence from the geophysical data alone, without excavation to test what the anomalies actually correspond to. It is partly because the conventional focus of Stonehenge research has been on the architectural and astronomical characteristics of the monument and the near-surface archaeology of its immediate surroundings, rather than on the deep subsurface. And it is partly because the deeper anomalies, some of which are at depths consistent with dissolution features in the underlying chalk rather than with anthropogenic deposits, raise questions that the current state of the investigation cannot fully answer. The chalk beneath the Stonehenge landscape is dissolving. This is not surprising. The chalk beneath all of the chalk landscape of southern England is dissolving, has been dissolving for millions of years, and produces dissolution features of the kind we discussed at the outset of this account. Some of the deeper geophysical anomalies in the Stonehenge survey data are consistent with dissolution features in the chalk. Whether those dissolution features are purely natural or whether they have been modified in the way that the Wiltshire chalk features documented by Marsh and the subsequent archaeological team have been modified is a question that the geophysical data cannot definitively answer. It is a question that excavation directed at the anomalies could potentially answer. Such excavation has not been conducted. Whether it will be conducted depends on the decisions of the relevant authorities, who control access to the Stonehenge World Heritage Site and whose approach to the research program for the site has been appropriately cautious given the international significance of the landscape and the irreversible nature of excavation. What can be said is that the possibility of underground features at the Stonehenge landscape, features in the chalk below the near-surface archaeological layer, features that might represent the underground dimension of the monument complex, in the same way that underground features appear to represent the underground dimension of the long barrow complexes of the same period elsewhere in Britain, is a possibility that the geophysical data has raised and that the current state of the investigation has not resolved. The possibility is real. The evidence for it is preliminary and not conclusive. The investigation required to resolve it has not been conducted, and the Stonehenge case, precisely because of its prominence and its accessibility and the intensity of research attention it attracts, is the case whose resolution would have the largest impact on the broader understanding of the relationship between surface monuments and underground features in the Neolithic and Bronze Age landscape of Britain. This is where the story of Britain's underground tunnels connects most directly to the story that most people already know about Britain's past. Not through obscure cave systems or remote Scottish souterrains or the technical literature of underwater archaeology, but through the most famous monument on the island, through the landscape that has defined the public image of Britain's prehistoric past for generations. If the underground dimension of that landscape is real, if there are features below the Stonehenge surface that connect to the tradition we have been documenting throughout this account, then the public understanding of what Stonehenge is and what it meant to the people who built it will need to be substantially revised, and the revision will make the monument not simpler, but more complex, not more fully explained, but more deeply mysterious, not a problem solved, but a question opened more widely. That is the nature of genuine archaeological discovery. It does not simplify, it deepens, it reveals that what you thought you understood was understood only at the surface, and that below the surface there is more depth, more complexity, more of the human past that the investigation has not yet reached. Let us spend time on Wales now. Wales deserves specific attention in this account because the Welsh contribution to the story of Britain's underground is distinctive and significant and has not been adequately represented in the accounts of this subject that focus primarily on England and Scotland. Wales has its own geological character, its own landscape, its own long tradition of human occupation, and its own category of underground features that connect to the broader pattern we have been describing, while having specific characteristics that reflect the specific geology and the specific cultural traditions of this part of the island. The limestone of South Wales, particularly the limestone of the Brecon Beacons and the Vale of Neath and the Carboniferous belt that runs across the south of the country, contains cave systems that have been explored and documented since the 19th century, and that include some of the longest and most complex underground systems in Britain. Dan Yair Ogof, now partly developed as a show cave and tourist attraction, is part of a system that extends for over 17 kilometers of documented passages and chambers, and that, in its undeveloped sections, contains archaeological material from multiple periods of human use, going back to the Mesolithic. The archaeological material from Dan Yair Ogof was first documented in the early 20th century, when the cave was initially explored by brothers from the local farming community, who were among the first modern people to penetrate beyond the show cave sections into the deeper passages of the system. What they found in those deeper passages included human skeletal remains, personal objects, and animal bones in context that the subsequent archaeological analysis placed in the Bronze Age and earlier periods. The human remains were of particular significance because they represented individuals who had been brought deep into the cave system, well beyond the entrance zone where natural lighting provides some visibility, and interred there in ways that implied deliberate selection of the underground location for burial. Not burial in a cave mouth where the association with the underground is incidental. Burial deep in the system, in darkness, in a location requiring deliberate effort and deliberate knowledge to reach. The Bronze Age use of Dan Yair Ogof for burial in the deep cave is not unique to this site. It is part of a pattern of deep cave use in Wales that extends across multiple cave systems in the limestone country, and that the available dating evidence places consistently in the Bronze Age and sometimes earlier. The pattern is not adequately explained by accident or convenience. People who are burying their dead deep in cave systems, in darkness, at the end of passages that require sustained effort to navigate, are making choices that reflect a specific cosmological framework within which the underground location has specific meaning for the treatment of the dead. The underground is not simply an available space, it is the appropriate space for something that the cultural framework of the relevant communities required to happen underground. What cosmological framework, what understanding of the relationship between the underground and the dead motivated these repeated choices? The physical evidence preserves the choices, but not the reasoning behind them. The reasoning was part of the cultural knowledge of the communities that made those choices, transmitted through the mechanisms of oral tradition and ceremonial practice that do not preserve in the archaeological record the way that physical deposits do. What the physical deposits confirm is that the reasoning was consistent, that the choice of deep underground locations for specific activities was made repeatedly and at multiple sites across a substantial geographical area and a substantial temporal range. Consistent choices imply consistent reasoning. The reasoning was there. We cannot directly access it, but its existence and something of its general character is implied by the consistency of the behavior it motivated. The implications extend beyond the Bronze Age. The cultural framework that motivated deep cave burial in Wales was not invented in the Bronze Age without precedent. It had antecedents that the archaeological record preserves partially in the earlier phases of use that the cave systems document at depths of deposit below the Bronze Age material, and in the broader tradition of underground engagement that the evidence from across Britain is revealing. The Bronze Age, deep cave burials of Wales are one expression of a tradition that goes back further, back to the Mesolithic occupation of the Mendip caves and the early Neolithic use of the Wiltshire chalk passages and all the other earlier expressions of the same fundamental engagement with the underground that the evidence from across the island documents. The Welsh dimension of this tradition has its own specific character. The Wales of the Bronze Age and Iron Age was a landscape of significant cultural complexity, connected through trade and through the movement of ideas and materials to the broader cultural world of Atlantic Europe. The copper mining of the Great Orme Headland in North Wales, where Bronze Age copper extraction has been extensively documented in underground workings that represent one of the largest known Bronze Age mining operations in Europe, is the most dramatic demonstration of the Welsh engagement with the underground in the service of resource extraction in this period. The Great Orme mines go deep into the limestone headland, following the copper ore veins through passages that required both geological knowledge and mining engineering of a high order. The Great Orme mining is documented, it is published. It has been the subject of sustained archaeological investigation over several decades, and the published results represent the best characterized ancient mine in Britain. What is less well characterized, though documented in the excavation reports in ways that specialists in the field recognize as significant, is the relationship between the mining activity and the human remains that have been found in the mine workings at Great Orme. The remains are not exclusively miners who died in accidents, though mine fatalities in ancient underground operations are to be expected. Some of the human material from the Great Orme mines is in positions and contexts that suggest deliberate placement rather than accidental inclusion. Deliberate placement of human remains in the mine workings is consistent with the broader pattern of deliberate underground use of human remains that the Bronze Age deep cave burials of South Wales also represent. Both suggest a cultural framework in which the underground was a significant domain for the treatment of the dead, whether that treatment took the form of burial in a natural cave or deposition within a human-made underground working. The Great Orme mines and the Dan Yr Ogof cave system are at opposite ends of Wales geographically, north and south, coastal and inland. One, a human-made underground working in pursuit of a specific economic resource. The other, a natural cave system used for purposes that the storage and the economic explanations do not adequately cover. But both show the same characteristic engagement with the underground as a domain with significance for the treatment of the dead. Both are part of the Welsh expression of the broader British tradition, whose outline we have been tracing, and both, in their specific Welsh character, add dimensions to that tradition that neither the English nor the Scottish evidence provides alone. The study of the British underground as a unified tradition, rather than as a collection of regionally specific phenomena that happen to share certain superficial similarities, has barely begun. The Welsh evidence, the Scottish evidence, the English evidence in all its geological and geographical variety have been studied primarily within regional frameworks that emphasize the differences between them. The synthesis that would emphasize the common thread, the single tradition of underground engagement that runs beneath and through all the regional variation, is one of the most significant remaining tasks in the study of the British past. When that synthesis is produced, Wales will be recognised as one of its most important contributors. The deep cave burials, the mining traditions, the underground water management of the Welsh limestone country, the landscape archaeology of the Welsh uplands with its connections to underground features that the survey work has so far only partially characterised, all of this will contribute to a picture of Welsh underground engagement that matches in its significance and its antiquity the best that England or Scotland can offer. But the synthesis requires the engagement of Welsh archaeologists and geologists and historians in the project in ways that the current fragmented state of the investigation does not facilitate. It requires the resources and the institutional coordination to conduct the landscape-scale investigations that would reveal the full extent of the underground tradition in Wales as it would reveal it everywhere else in Britain. And it requires the willingness of the relevant academic and funding institutions to invest in a project that crosses disciplinary boundaries and regional conventions in ways that the conventional structures of British academic research have historically made difficult. The difficulty is not insurmountable. It is the difficulty of organization, of bringing together the right combination of expertise and resources and institutional support to mount an investigation at the scale that the evidence demands. That combination is being assembled, slowly, incompletely, but with a direction that is clear and a momentum that is building, because the evidence keeps arriving, the individual findings keep accumulating, the pattern keeps becoming more visible, and the case for the landscape-scale investigation that would reveal the full picture keeps getting stronger. Until the investigation happens at the required scale, the individual findings continue to do the work of building the case, and they are doing it in the Mendip spatial analysis and the Perthshire network documentation and the Welsh cave burials and the Great Orme mining evidence and the Wiltshire chalk passage dating and all the other specific methodically documented findings that we have been discussing throughout this account. Each one is a data point. Together they are a pattern, and the pattern is pointing in a direction that the conventional understanding of Britain's past has not yet fully followed. Follow it now, down into the chalk, into the limestone, into the sandstone and the granite, into the places where the underground tradition of Britain has left its evidence, patient and real and available for the scientific investigation, that is, piece by piece, beginning to recover it. The findings are real. The evidence is real. The tradition is real. And the story it tells of an island whose underground was as fully and as richly human as its surface for as long as human beings have been on it is as real as anything that the surface of Britain has ever been able to show. This is what scientists found in the tunnels beneath Britain. This is why the world has been shocked. Not by a single dramatic discovery, but by the slow accumulation of evidence for a depth and a complexity and a sophistication of underground engagement that the conventional picture of this island's past simply does not contain. The conventional picture needs to be larger, deeper, more three-dimensional, more fully expressive of what the evidence, all of it together, says about the people who have been here and what they knew and what they built and what they cared enough about to go underground for. Going underground for something is not a small decision. It is not accidental. It is not the lazy choice or the convenient choice or the path of least resistance. Underground environments are dark and damp and cold and difficult to navigate and require specific knowledge and specific equipment and specific organizational commitment to use effectively. The people who went underground in Britain, across the long span of the tradition we have been documenting, went because the underground had something they needed, something that the surface did not offer, something that was worth the effort and the discomfort and the organizational cost of going underground to get. What was that something? The evidence is not entirely clear. The something was different at different times and in different places and for different communities with different needs and different cosmological frameworks. The practical something, the water management and the food storage and the mineral extraction, is the most straightforwardly documented. The ritual and cosmological something, the use of underground spaces for activities that required the specific sensory and symbolic character of the underground environment, is more challenging to document directly, but is consistently implied by the evidence of features and deposits that do not fit the practical explanations. The combination of the practical and the cosmological in the underground tradition of Britain is itself significant. It suggests that the distinction between the practical and the cosmological, which the modern scientific framework treats as fundamental, was not drawn in the same way by the communities that created this tradition. For them, the underground was practical and cosmological simultaneously. Managing the water supply was a cosmological act as well as a practical one. Extracting copper from the rock was embedded in a framework of understanding in which the rock had significance beyond its mineral content. Going underground was moving between domains of reality that were differently charged and differently appropriate for different kinds of activity. This is not a mystical claim. It is an anthropological observation. Every human culture embeds its practical activities in cosmological frameworks that give those activities meaning beyond their immediate material outcomes. Farming is not just the production of food. Mining is not just the extraction of minerals. Going underground is not just the navigation of geological features. These activities are also cosmological, also significant in ways that transcend the immediately practical. The cosmological dimension of the British underground tradition does not make the tradition less real or less empirically demonstrable. It makes it more human, more fully expressive of what human beings actually are and how human communities actually function. The evidence from the tunnels beneath Britain is evidence of human beings being fully human, practical and cosmological simultaneously, using the underground for the things it was good for in practical terms, while also engaging with it as a domain of meaning and significance that transcended the practical. Building infrastructure that served real needs, while also building it in ways that reflected a framework of understanding in which the underground was a dimension of the world with its own character and its own appropriate uses. Understanding this, the dual character of the tradition, is essential to understanding what the scientists have found when they have gone into the tunnels. They have found the evidence of both, the practical evidence, the management features and the extraction evidence and the storage features, and the evidence of the other kind of engagement, the evidence that points toward activities whose purpose was not practical in the immediate material sense, but was deeply purposeful in the broader human sense. Evidence of communities that knew what they were doing underground and that did it with intention and with the full weight of a cultural framework that made the doing meaningful. That is the complete picture that the tunnels beneath Britain are building toward. A picture not just of practical underground infrastructure, but of a complete human engagement with the underground dimension of the British landscape. An engagement that was as old as human presence on the island and that expressed itself in every period of that presence in forms appropriate to the specific geological and cultural context of each period. An engagement that was systematic and organized and sustained by transmitted knowledge and by the cosmological frameworks that gave that knowledge its authority and its social force. An engagement that produced features whose physical evidence is still available for the scientific investigation, that is, at last, beginning to do it justice. That investigation is the story of what scientists have found in the tunnels beneath Britain. And the story is not finished. It will not be finished for a very long time, because the underground of Britain is deep, and the evidence of the human tradition it contains is more extensive than any investigation conducted so far has been able to fully reveal. But it is being revealed, finding by finding, date by date, survey by survey, in the chalk and the limestone and the sandstone and the granite, in the managed springs, sources, and the souterrain networks and the deep cave deposits and the submerged coastal sites. In the spaces below the surface of this ancient island where the past has been waiting, patient and complete, for the scientists willing to go down and look. The shock is the beginning of understanding, and the understanding, when it comes, will show us Britain as it has always been, below the surface, in the depth, in the extraordinary, ancient, fully human underground that runs beneath this island, from its chalk shores to its granite peaks, and that has been part of the story of this place since the first human being looked at the ground and decided to go below it. That is what scientists found in the tunnels beneath Britain. That is what has shocked the entire world. And that is the story that the underground of Britain is still telling. Every time a new tunnel is entered and a new finding is made, and the world receives another piece of the picture, that is, slowly and irrevocably, changing everything we thought we knew about this island and its past. The tunnels go down, the story goes back. And in the dark beneath Britain, the oldest chapters of the longest story this island knows how to tell are still being read, one finding at a time, by the scientists who go down to look. Sleep well with that beneath you. There is a part of this story that takes us into territory that is less comfortable for the mainstream academic framework, and that I want to address directly and carefully, because it deserves honest engagement rather than avoidance. It is the question of what the underground tradition of Britain, as extensive and as ancient as the evidence suggests it is, implies about the level of social organization and the complexity of knowledge systems in prehistoric Britain. And specifically, whether the evidence supports a picture of prehistoric British communities that is substantially more organized and more sophisticated than the conventional academic model has been willing to propose. The conventional model of prehistoric Britain, particularly for the periods before the agricultural transition and the construction of the well-known Neolithic monuments, tends toward a picture of relatively simple social organization. Mobile or semi-mobile groups, small in number, organized primarily around kinship, without the kind of durable leadership or institutional structure that sustained, large-scale, coordinated activity requires. This picture is not arbitrary, it is supported by evidence. The subsistence strategies of mobile hunter-gatherer populations do not typically support the kind of surplus that allows some members of a community to specialize in non-subsistence activities, and it is typically specialization and surplus that drive increases in social complexity in the models that archaeologists use to understand social change. But the underground evidence is pushing back against this model in specific and targeted ways. The modified chalk passages of Wiltshire were not created by a single individual working alone. They required coordination. The Perthshire souterrain network was not built by a small family group in a single season. It required sustained, organized effort over extended periods. The management of chalk spring sources in Hampshire required knowledge that was specific enough to require specialists and organized enough to be applied systematically across multiple locations. None of these activities is consistent with the simplest version of the mobile hunter-gatherer model. They are consistent with something more organized, with communities that had developed mechanisms for coordinating collective effort at scales that the simplest models do not attribute to the relevant periods. This does not require abandoning the mobile hunter-gatherer model entirely. It requires revising it in ways that accommodate a greater degree of organization and coordination than the simplest version of the model allows. The revision might involve recognizing that mobility and organization are not mutually exclusive, that mobile communities can be, and in ethnographically documented cases, frequently are highly organized, with sophisticated mechanisms for coordination and collective effort that produce substantial infrastructure investments at specific landscape nodes. The underground features of Britain may be the material evidence of exactly this kind of organization. Investment by mobile or semi-mobile communities at specific landscape nodes, the caves and the chalk dissolution features, and the spring sources and the geological passages, that were significant in the cosmological and practical frameworks of those communities, creating there the infrastructure that their activities required. This is not a radical revision. It is a nuanced one. It does not claim that prehistoric British society was more complex than the evidence supports. It claims that the evidence, when the underground evidence is added to the surface evidence, supports a level of complexity that the surface evidence alone was not able to demonstrate. The surface evidence alone tended toward the simpler model because the surface evidence for the earlier periods of British prehistory was scarce and episodic. The underground evidence adds to it, and what the underground evidence adds, when properly assessed, is consistent with a picture of communities that were more organized and more capable of sustained, coordinated effort than the simplest version of the existing models has allowed. This is the kind of revision that good evidence produces in good science. Not a rejection of the existing framework, but an expansion of it. Not a claim that everything previously understood was wrong, but a claim that the picture was incomplete, and that the underground evidence completes it in specific and important ways. The framework grows. The picture becomes more accurate. The understanding deepens, and the shock of the revision is the productive shock of a model improved by evidence, not shattered by a contradiction, but enriched by an addition. The underground evidence for prehistoric Britain is an addition, a major one whose full implications are still being worked out, but an addition to an existing framework rather than a destruction of it. The researchers who have contributed the individual findings that are building this addition have not been trying to overthrow British prehistoric archaeology. They have been doing careful, methodically sound work in specific underground contexts and reporting honestly what they found. The picture that their work is building is not their invention. It is what the evidence says. Now, there is something specific about the Roman period and the Roman occupation of Britain that connects to the underground story in ways that have not been adequately discussed in the mainstream accounts of Roman Britain, and that deserve careful attention here. The Romans were extraordinary underground engineers. This is not contested. Roman engineering underground in Britain, the lead mines of the Mendips and the gold mines of Dolaucothi, and the coal workings of the northeast, and the extensive drainage and water supply infrastructure, is documented and studied, and its sophistication recognized. What is less well discussed is the evidence that the Romans, in certain locations in Britain, did not start from scratch with their underground engineering, that they found things already there and worked with them. The most extensively documented case of the Romans adapting pre-Roman underground infrastructure in Britain is at Aquae Sulis, the Roman name for the site of the sacred spring at what is now Bath in Somerset. The hot spring at Bath emerges from the ground at a constant temperature, heated by the geothermal gradient of the earth, and it has been doing so for as long as the geological conditions that produce the spring have existed. The spring was significant long before the Romans arrived. The archaeological evidence from the site shows pre-Roman activity in the vicinity of the spring, going back to at least the Iron Age and probably earlier. The Romans, arriving in the 1st century of the Common Era, did not create the sacred spring. They found it. And they built their elaborate bath complex around a pre-existing tradition of the spring's sanctity. The underground infrastructure at Bath, the lead pipes and the settling tanks and the drainage channels that the Romans constructed to manage the spring water in the context of their bathing complex, was built in relationship to the pre-existing underground geology of the spring source. The Romans understood that geology well enough to engineer effectively in relationship to it. But the question of whether they also encountered pre-Roman underground modification in the vicinity of the spring, modification that the Iron Age and earlier communities had made in relationship to the spring's significance, is not clearly answered by the published archaeological literature. The excavations at Bath have been extensive and have revealed important features of both the Roman and the pre-Roman periods. But the underground dimension of the pre-Roman phase, the question of whether the spring source was surrounded by modified underground features before the Romans arrived, has not been systematically investigated. This is partly because the Roman Baths complex is a World Heritage Site of enormous cultural significance, and access to the subsurface is tightly controlled. It is partly because the water table at the site is high, making underground archaeology technically demanding, and it is partly because the focus of investigation has been on the spectacular Roman remains rather than on the pre-Roman landscape that the Romans imposed themselves on. The pre-Roman underground at Bath is one of the most significant gaps in the documented underground archaeology of Britain. Its investigation, if it were ever conducted with the resources it would require, might reveal that the Roman choice to build at Bath was not simply a response to the practical resource of the hot spring, but was also a recognition of, and an engagement with, an already significant underground landscape that the pre-Roman communities of the region had already been working with for a very long time. Let us now address something that has been lurking at the margins of this entire account. The question of what the very oldest underground features in Britain are, not the oldest clearly dated features we have discussed, the Wiltshire chalk passages with their Mesolithic dates and the Yorkshire cave deposits from the same period, but the oldest possible underground features, the features from the deepest periods of human presence on the island, from the time before what we have been calling the deep past of Britain, from the periods that correspond to the earliest human presence in Britain known from the surface record. The earliest documented human presence in Britain is not Mesolithic. It is considerably older. At the site of Happisburgh on the coast of Norfolk, flint tools and footprints preserved in ancient sediments have been dated to approximately 850,000 years before the present. Nearly 1,000,000 years. The people, or rather the hominids, who made those tools and left those footprints were not anatomically modern humans. They were an earlier form of human ancestor, possibly Homo antecessor, moving through a Britain that was then connected to continental Europe by a land bridge and that had a climate somewhat warmer than the present day. They were here, on this island, for an extended period, as the distribution of dated early human material from sites across Britain demonstrates, and the question of whether they engaged with the underground of Britain in the way that their successors in the Mesolithic and later periods did is not one that can currently be answered. It cannot be answered because we do not have evidence from the underground record of Britain from that period. Not because the evidence is not there, but because finding it would require knowing where to look and being able to recognize it for what it is. And both of those prerequisites are currently beyond our capability. Archaic human tool used in underground environments 800,000 years ago, if it happened, would leave traces so subtle and so subject to confusion with natural processes that recognizing them as anthropogenic rather than geological would require a level of analysis and a degree of certainty that is simply not available to the current state of the science. The oldest confirmed underground use by anatomically modern humans in Britain is the Mesolithic material we have discussed, but the tradition that produced that Mesolithic underground use did not spring into existence fully formed in the Mesolithic. It had predecessors. The Mesolithic communities who modified the chalk passages and deposited material in the Yorkshire caves had learned from somewhere the knowledge and the disposition to engage with underground environments in the organized way that the evidence shows they did. That learning came from a tradition that preceded them, from communities that used underground environments before them and transmitted the knowledge of how to do so across generations, that eventually produced the Mesolithic underground activity we can document. How far back that tradition goes is a question that the available evidence cannot currently answer. The evidence for its Mesolithic expression is what we have. The deeper roots of the tradition in the earlier human presence on the island remain to be documented, if they can be documented at all given the challenges of recognizing archaic human underground activity in the ancient geology of Britain. But the existence of those deeper roots is implied. The tradition did not begin in the Mesolithic. It began earlier. How much earlier we do not know. This is one of the most significant remaining uncertainties in the study of Britain's underground past. It is also one of the most interesting. The question of how far back the human underground tradition in Britain goes, of when the first human beings in this island looked at a chalk passage or a limestone cave and decided not just to shelter in it, but to modify it, to make it serve a purpose beyond what the natural feature provided, is a question whose answer, if it were ever recoverable, would substantially deepen the picture of the deep past of human behavior on this island. The question is probably not recoverable in any complete sense. The evidence from the earliest periods of human presence in Britain is too sparse and too subject to geological disturbance to support the kind of systematic underground survey that would be required to find early anthropogenic modification in the geological record. But the question is real. And in science, real questions are worth asking, even when the answers are not immediately available. The asking of the question shapes the direction of the investigation and sometimes reveals paths toward partial answers that were not visible before the question was clearly posed. The question of the deep roots of the British underground tradition is now clearly posed by the evidence from the Mesolithic and Neolithic periods that establishes the tradition as already well developed in those periods, by the logic of cultural transmission that implies a precedent tradition before the documented periods, and by the accumulation of evidence from the documented periods that shows a tradition too organized and too knowledge-intensive to have been created from scratch in any short time. The roots are deep. We do not know how deep. Finding out will require investigations that have not yet been designed and resources that have not yet been allocated. But the investigation of the documented periods is itself advancing, and as it advances, as the individual findings accumulate and the synthesis begins to take shape, the picture of the British underground tradition that is emerging is one that demands those deeper roots. That requires them, because the sophistication of what the documented periods show is consistent only with a tradition that had time to develop. Time measured in generations before the periods for which we have the clearest evidence. The underground of Britain is older than the oldest things we have yet found in it. That is the nature of deep traditions. They go back further than the direct evidence yet reaches, and in Britain, whose geological record of human use extends back as far as the record goes, and whose underground features have been preserving evidence of that use, with a fidelity that the surface record rarely matches, the tradition goes back very far indeed. How far exactly, we are still discovering. Every time a new tunnel is entered, and a new deposit is sampled, and a new date arrives from the laboratory, the answer gets clearer, not complete, not final, but clearer, more constrained, closer to the truth that the underground has been keeping all along. That is the project, that is the investigation, that is the work being done in the tunnels beneath Britain by the scientists who go down to look and who come back with findings that continue to surprise them and to shock the world that receives those findings. Findings that push the dates back and extend the geography and deepen the complexity of a tradition that was already, before any of the modern investigation began, more remarkable than the surface story of this island had ever managed to convey. This is the Britain of the underground, not the Britain of history books and tourist visits and the comfortable national narrative, the Britain of chalk passages and souterrain networks and deep cave deposits and managed spring sources and submerged coastal sites and the fog of evidence that has been accumulating patiently in the records of geological surveys and archaeological excavations and caving club reports and Victorian engineering archives, waiting for the synthesis that would make the pattern visible. The pattern is becoming visible. The scientists are seeing it. The world is being told about it. And the shock of the telling, the shock of a depth and a complexity and a sophistication that the conventional account was not prepared for, is doing what genuine discovery always does. It is changing the understanding, making it larger, making it deeper, making it more accurate and more complete and more fully expressive of what this island actually is and what the human story on it has actually been. That is the gift of the tunnels beneath Britain, the gift of depth, the gift of time, the gift of a past more extensive and more human and more extraordinary than the surface has ever been able to show. Take the gift, use it, let it change how you understand this island and the people who have been on it since the beginning, since before the beginning that the history books describe, since the real beginning, which was very long ago indeed, and which was, from its very earliest moments, a beginning that included the underground as well as the surface. Britain has always known its underground. The scientists who have gone into it are recovering that knowledge, piece by piece, from the evidence that the underground has preserved. The recovery is incomplete. It will take more time than any single generation of researchers can provide. But it is happening, and what is being recovered is extraordinary. In the chalk and the limestone and the sandstone and the granite, in the caves and the passages and the chambers and the modified dissolution features and the managed spring sources and the souterrain networks and the deep cave deposits, in the dark beneath the surface of this ancient island, where the past lives, patient and complete, waiting for the lights that the scientists bring down when they come to look. They have been coming to look for decades in various capacities and various geological formations and various periods of the archaeological record. Scientists and researchers have been going underground in Britain and finding things and reporting what they found and building, piece by piece, the picture of a tradition that the surface story of this island was never going to be sufficient to reveal. The picture is building, the pattern is emerging, the tradition is becoming visible, and the world that is receiving the findings, the world that is being shocked by what the tunnels beneath Britain contain, is a world that is slowly beginning to understand what it is being told. It is being told that this island is old in ways that the conventional story does not fully capture, that its underground was part of its human landscape from the beginning, that the people who inhabited it across all the periods of the long human story here were not simply on the surface. They were also below it, moving through it, using it, making it serve the needs, practical and cosmological, that their communities required of the landscape they inhabited, and that the evidence of this underground inhabitation, patient and durable in the geological formations that preserved it, is available for the investigation that can recover it. That investigation is underway. It is the story of what scientists found in the tunnels beneath Britain. It is the shock of what they found there. And it is the understanding that the findings are building, slowly and surely, and with the methodological care that genuine science demands, toward the full picture of what Britain's underground has been across all the time that human beings have been on this island. The full picture is not yet assembled, but its outline is visible, and the outline shows an island whose underground was as fully and as intentionally part of the human story here as its surface, whose underground tradition was deep in time and extensive in geography, and sophisticated in its knowledge and organized in its execution, whose underground features preserve a record of human activity that extends the documented story of this island's past back further and makes it more complex and more human than the surface record alone could ever demonstrate. That is what the tunnels beneath Britain contain. That is what the scientists found there. That is why the world has been shocked. And that is the story, still being told, still being added to, still being built from the individual findings of individual researchers in individual geological and archaeological contexts across this remarkable and ancient island. The story is not finished. Good stories rarely are. And the story of the underground of Britain, which is the story of the deepest past of this island and of the human engagement with that past across all the time it encompasses, is a story that has enough depth and enough complexity and enough extraordinary evidence to keep the telling going for a very long time indeed. The tunnels are there. The scientists are going in. The findings are coming out. The world is being changed by what it receives. And beneath Britain, in the dark, the oldest chapters of the longest story, this island knows how to tell, are still being read. One finding at a time, patient as stone, in the dark beneath Britain, where the past has always been, and where the future of our understanding of this island's deepest story will be written by the scientists, willing to go down and look. This is the story, and it is extraordinary, and it is real. The Orkney question. We cannot tell the story of what has been found in the tunnels beneath Britain without spending serious time in the Northern Isles, because Orkney is a landscape whose surface monuments have attracted so much attention for so long that the underground dimension of the same landscape has been correspondingly underplayed, and the underplaying is a genuine loss for the understanding of what made Orkney such a remarkable centre of cultural activity in the late Neolithic. Orkney is a group of islands off the northern tip of Scotland. Their latitude makes them cold and wind-battered, and their geology, a combination of old red sandstone and limestone, makes them a landscape of particular character. Flat-topped hills and sheltered bays, and grassland that in summer is extraordinarily green and productive, and in winter can be brutal in ways that make the achievement of the communities who built major monuments there all the more striking. The monuments are extraordinary. The Ring of Brodgar, the stones of Stennis, the Maeshowe chambered cairn, the Ness of Brodgar complex with its recently discovered profusion of major structures, all of these are recognised as components of an Orcadian Neolithic that was among the most culturally sophisticated in the British Isles. The underground dimension of Orkney's Neolithic has been recognised primarily in connection with Maeshowe, the great chambered cairn whose inner chamber was designed with the solstice alignment that fills it with direct sunlight on the midwinter solstice afternoon, bathing the stone interior of the chamber in golden light for a brief period each year that the original builders clearly planned for and engineered toward. Maeshowe is underground in the sense that its chamber and passages are below the surface of the mound that covers it. It is the most thoroughly studied underground monument in Orkney and one of the most studied in Britain. Its astronomical alignment, its construction technique, its stratigraphic history of use and modification have all been documented to a degree that makes it one of the best understood prehistoric underground monuments in the world. But Maeshowe is not the only underground feature in the Orkney Neolithic landscape. It sits in a landscape whose underground has been systematically investigated only in the restricted area directly associated with known surface monuments. The wider landscape of the Orkney mainland, the largest island of the group, contains geological formations that are amenable to underground modification in ways that have not been systematically surveyed. The old red sandstone of Orkney is soft enough to be cut by hand tools and has been cut as the evidence of stone-built souterrains on the islands demonstrates. Those souterrains are Iron Age by their dating and their associations, and they represent the later expression of the underground tradition in Orkney. But whether there is an earlier expression, a Neolithic or Bronze Age underground engagement with the Orcadian subsurface that preceded the souterrains and that was connected to the extraordinary surface monument-building culture of the islands in the late Neolithic, is a question that has not been systematically investigated. The analogy with the Wiltshire and Yorkshire cases is suggestive. In both those cases, as we have discussed, the underground features of the relevant geological formations predated the most visible surface monument activity and appear to have informed the placement of the surface monuments in ways that imply awareness of the underground as part of the landscape being worked with. If the same relationship obtained in Orkney, the underground features of the Orcadian limestone and sandstone, should show evidence of use in the Neolithic period and should cluster in spatial relationship to the surface monuments of that period in ways consistent with the pattern documented in the south and the north of mainland Britain. Testing this hypothesis in Orkney would require a geophysical survey program of the kind that could identify subsurface anomalies between and around the known surface monuments. Such surveys have been conducted in the immediate vicinity of Maeshowe and the Ness of Brodgar for purposes related to those specific sites, and the results have included anomalies in the broader landscape that have not been specifically followed up as potential underground features. A dedicated program directed at testing the underground dimension of the Orcadian Neolithic landscape would require additional resources and additional focus, but it would be building on a foundation of existing geophysical data that already hints at the possibility of significant subsurface features. This is the situation across too much of the British prehistoric landscape. The geophysical data exists. The anomalies are there in the data. The resources to follow them up with the targeted excavation that would definitively characterize them have not been organized. And the underground features that the anomalies represent, whatever they are, wait. Let us now talk about something that brings the underground story of Britain into conversation with the wider question of how Britain connected to the rest of the world in the deep past. The question of Atlantic connections, of the relationship between the underground tradition of Britain and the underground traditions of Ireland and Brittany and Iberia and the other communities around the Atlantic fringe of Europe, who built the same kinds of monuments, used the same kinds of underground spaces, and shared a maritime cultural world that connected them across the open ocean in ways that the distribution of similar cultural traditions across the Atlantic coasts confirms. The megalithic traditions of the Atlantic fringe are well documented in their surface expressions. The chambered cairns of Britain and Ireland and Brittany and Portugal and Spain are variations on a common theme, a theme of large stone chamber construction within earthen mounds, aligned to astronomical phenomena, used for burial and for the activities of the living as well as the dead, that distributed itself across the Atlantic margins of Europe in the Neolithic period. The distribution implies connection. These communities were not independently inventing the same cultural forms in isolation. They were sharing ideas and materials and perhaps personnel across the sea routes of the Atlantic coast. The underground dimension of the Atlantic megalithic tradition is less well studied than its surface expression, for the same reasons that the underground dimension of the British Neolithic in particular has been less studied than the surface. But what has been documented of the underground features associated with Atlantic megalithic monuments in Ireland and Brittany suggests that the pattern we have identified in Britain of surface monuments in relationship to underground features is not uniquely British. It appears across the Atlantic tradition. The passage tombs of the Boyne Valley in Ireland, of which Newgrange is the most famous, are the most extensively studied example of the Atlantic megalithic tradition outside Britain. Newgrange, like Maeshowe, is designed around a solstice alignment that floods its interior chamber with direct sunlight at the winter solstice. Like Maeshowe, it sits in a landscape whose underground dimension has not been systematically investigated. The Boyne Valley has other significant monuments at Knowth and Dowth and a landscape full of smaller features. The geological substrate of the Boyne Valley is limestone in some areas and older rocks in others. Whether the limestone areas contain modified underground features associated with the Neolithic period, as the British limestone areas are showing to do, has not been the subject of systematic investigation. The connections between the British underground tradition and the Irish underground tradition, between the British surface monuments and the Irish surface monuments, between the knowledge systems of the communities that built and used both, are connections that the conventional academic treatment of the Atlantic Neolithic has not yet fully integrated. The focus on the surface monuments, on the stones and the mounds and the astronomical alignments has been the dominant research program. The underground dimension of the tradition, which the British evidence suggests was as significant as the surface dimension, has been the subordinate and under-investigated component. A research program that addressed both the British and the Irish underground in an integrated way, that looked at the relationship between the underground features of both islands and the surface monuments that may be associated with them, and that tested whether the pattern visible in Britain appears also in Ireland, would be one of the most significant advances in Atlantic Neolithic studies that the current state of the evidence would support. The precedent of the British findings provides the hypothesis. The Irish geological and archaeological landscape provides the testing ground. What is lacking is the organised, funded, collaborative programme that would bring the investigation to bear on the hypothesis. The lack is not permanent. It is a gap in the current state of organisation and funding, not a gap in the evidence or in the methods available to investigate it. The gap will close. As the British findings continue to accumulate and their significance becomes more widely recognised, the case for extending the investigation to the Irish dimension of the same tradition will become more compelling and more fundable. The synthesis of the Atlantic Neolithic underground, when it eventually happens, will be one of the most significant advances in the understanding of the deep past of the Atlantic fringe of Europe. Now let us come back to Britain specifically and go to a part of the country we have not yet discussed, the northeast of England, the county of Northumberland, the Cheviot Hills, the border country between England and Scotland, where the geological history is complex and the human history is long, and the landscape has a quality of ancientness that is different from the more heavily visited prehistoric landscapes of the south and west. Northumberland is underlain by a variety of geological formations. The coal measures of the coastal plain that powered the Industrial Revolution of the northeast are underlain by older formations of limestone and sandstone that contain features of interest to the underground story of Britain. The limestone of the northern Pennines and the Cheviot area has its own dissolution features, though less extensively developed than the Yorkshire Dale systems. The sandstone of the region has its own tradition of rock-cut features, less well studied than the Midland sandstone tradition, but present in the landscape in ways that the regional archaeological literature has partially documented. The most significant underground feature in Northumberland for the purposes of this account is not geological, but was created from geological materials. At a site in the hills above the River Coquet, a river that runs east from the Cheviots to the North Sea, and that has been an important route through the landscape since at least the Bronze Age, there is a complex of features that was first partially documented by a local archaeologist in the 1930s and that has received intermittent attention since then without ever being the subject of a systematic modern investigation. The features include surface elements, stone arrangements, and earthworks of Iron Age character, and underground elements. Passages cut into the local sandstone that connect certain of the surface features to below-ground chambers. The underground elements were described by the 1930s investigator as unusual in their extent and in certain characteristics of their construction that he was not able to explain within the frameworks available to him. His description of them is careful and detailed and contains observations about specific features of the construction that remain unexplained by any subsequent researcher who has reviewed his account, because the subsequent researchers who have reviewed the account have not visited the site with the specific intention of investigating the underground elements. The Coquet Valley features are known. They are documented, after a fashion, in the 1930s account and in subsequent references to that account in the regional archaeological literature. They have not been properly investigated. The site is in a remote location. Access requires a substantial walk over open moorland. The underground elements are partially collapsed and partially obscured by later material. None of these are insurmountable obstacles. They are practical constraints that would yield to a properly resourced site visit by a research team with the appropriate expertise and the appropriate equipment. The research team has not been assembled. The investigation has not happened. The Coquet Valley features wait, as so many of the underground features of Britain, wait for the attention that the evidence they contain warrants. But the pattern they are part of does not wait. The pattern continues to build, with or without the Coquet Valley features being properly characterized, because the other pieces of the pattern are accumulating at sufficient rate to make the pattern visible. The Coquet Valley features would add another node, another data point, another confirmation, potentially, of the pattern that the documented features are already establishing. Their absence from the fully analyzed record is a loss, but it is not a fatal loss. The pattern exists without them. Their eventual inclusion will strengthen it, not create it. And the pattern, the broad pattern of deliberate underground engagement with the geological landscape of Britain, across a very long span of time, by communities whose sophistication and organizational capacity exceeded what the conventional model attributed to them, is what matters most. The pattern is the finding. The individual sites are the evidence for the pattern. And the evidence is real. The scientists who found it went into the ground to look for it and came back with what they found. The world that received what they found was shocked. And the understanding that is being built from the finding is one that will, when it is complete, show this island and its past in dimensions that the surface story has never been able to reveal. There is one final specific location that I want to visit before we bring this account to its close. A place that is, in some ways, the most surprising location for underground archaeological mystery in Britain, because it is not a remote Wiltshire hillside or a highland limestone system or a windswept Orcadian field. It is in the middle of a modern city. It is in London, and it connects the story of Britain's underground past to the ongoing life of the world's most studied and most visited city in ways that most people who live in or visit London would find genuinely unexpected. London is built on a geological substrate of Thames, gravels, and clay that is not, at first consideration, the obvious foundation for an underground tradition of the kind we have been discussing. The clay and gravel of the Thames Basin do not produce dissolution features of the chalk or limestone kind. They are not amenable to the kind of modification that the chalk and limestone of the south and the north have produced. The natural underground of the Thames Basin is not the same kind of underground as the natural underground of the chalk downlands, 20 miles to the south, or the limestone country further afield. But humans have been modifying the Thames Basin underground for a very long time, not through the exploitation of naturally dissolved features, through excavation, through the direct and forcible removal of material to create spaces that were not there before. And those excavations in the city that has been built and rebuilt and built again on the north bank of the Thames for at least 2,000 years of documented occupation and for an unknown period before that, have created an underground that is as complex and as layered as the surface city above it. The famous underground rivers of London, the Fleet and the Walbrook, and the Tyburn and the Effra and the others, now culverted beneath the city and running in their brick-lined channels to the Thames without ever seeing daylight, are one dimension of this underground. The medieval and post-medieval cellars, the Victorian sewers, the underground railway tunnels, the wartime bunkers, the utility tunnels, all of these are the documented modern dimensions of the London Underground. They are extensive and they are complex, and they produce, when excavated in the course of construction or maintenance work, a continuous supply of archaeological finds from every period of the city's occupation. But the London Underground also has dimensions that predate the documented occupation. The Thames gravels contain evidence of human activity going back to the Paleolithic, to the earliest periods of human presence in Britain. Hand axes and animal bones and occasional fragments of other material from periods stretching back hundreds of thousands of years are found in Thames gravel deposits whenever those deposits are disturbed by construction work. London is built on a Paleolithic, river terrace landscape. The evidence of the people who occupied that landscape before it became a major urban centre is there, preserved in the gravels below the later deposits that record the city's more familiar history. And, in certain locations beneath modern London, excavation has revealed things that are genuinely hard to account for within the conventional timeline of the city's development. Not dramatically hard, not in ways that require the invocation of lost civilizations or alien technologies, but quietly, persistently hard in the way that evidence from the wrong layer in a stratigraphic sequence is always hard to account for without either accepting that the evidence is where it appears to be, in which case the timeline needs revision, or explaining it as disturbed from its original position, which requires a specific mechanism that the context sometimes does not provide. The specific instances of out-of-sequence material in the London archaeological record are documented in the technical excavation reports that the city's extensive development program has generated over decades of developer-funded archaeology. They appear as anomalous notes in reports focused on other things. They are noted and explained, sometimes satisfactorily and sometimes less so, and then the report moves on to the main findings that the excavation was designed to investigate. The anomalous notes accumulate in the vast archive of London archaeological reports without being synthesized into a picture of what they collectively suggest. What they collectively suggest, if you read through enough of them, with the underground tradition of Britain in mind, is that the human occupation of the Thames Basin goes deeper and back further than the documented history of London accounts for. That the gravels beneath the city preserve evidence of organized human activity from periods before the recognized settlement sequence begins, and that somewhere in the record of what has been found during the continuous excavation of this city's ground over the past century and more, there are pieces of the underground story of Britain that have not yet been properly recognized as such, because the framework for recognizing them was not in place when they were found. The London Underground Archaeological Archive is one of the largest and richest repositories of excavation data in the world, mining it for the evidence of pre-urban human activity that the London landscape preserves, with the specific focus on underground features and early occupation that the broader story of Britain's underground tradition demands, is a project that has not been attempted at the scale the archive would support. The data is there. The analytical framework is being developed by the broader investigation of Britain's underground. The synthesis of the London data with that analytical framework remains to be achieved. This is the last piece of the pattern we have been building throughout this account. London, the most urban and most modern of British landscapes, sitting on a substrate of ancient geological deposits that preserves the evidence of the deepest past of the Thames Basin, in the same way that the chalk and the limestone and the sandstone of the more obviously ancient parts of the country preserve the evidence of their own deep pasts. The underground of London is different in form from the underground of Wiltshire or Yorkshire or Scotland, but it is part of the same story. The story of a landscape inhabited across enormous spans of time by human communities who knew the ground beneath their feet and used it and left their traces in it. Traces that are still there, patient and durable, waiting for the synthesis that will make the full picture visible. That synthesis is the project. The investigation of Britain's underground is the project. The recovery of the evidence that the underground has preserved in chalk and limestone and sandstone and granite and Thames gravel from the Paleolithic to the present is the project that the scientists who have been going into the tunnels and coming back with findings have been advancing. Not alone, not in any single coordinated program, but collectively, cumulatively, through the accumulation of individual findings, that each add a piece to the picture, and that together, when properly synthesized, will change the understanding of Britain's past in ways that the surface story alone was never going to be able to achieve. The underground of Britain is waiting for that synthesis, patient as stone, as it has always been patient, as it will continue to be patient until the synthesis happens and the picture is finally assembled in its full complexity and its full depth. And when it is assembled, when the full picture is finally visible, the world that looks at it will be shocked again. Not by any single finding within it, by the whole of it, by the depth and the extent and the sophistication and the extraordinary antiquity of a tradition that was always there, always present in the ground beneath the island, always available to be found by anyone willing to go down and look. They are going down. They are looking. The findings are coming. The picture is assembling, and the world is being changed by it, in the way that genuine discovery always changes the world, by showing it something real that it did not see before, something deep, something old, something extraordinary, something that was always there, in the tunnels beneath Britain, in the dark, waiting. There is a particular kind of scientist who goes underground. Not all scientists are drawn to confined, dark, cold, wet spaces that require both physical courage and a tolerance for disorientation that most people who have spent their careers in well-lit laboratories and seminar rooms have not had occasion to develop. The scientists who go underground in Britain are a specific and somewhat unusual subset of the broader scientific community. They tend to be people who became interested in what was below the surface early in their careers, often through an accident of discovery, through encountering an underground feature while investigating something else, and who found that the underground asked questions that the surface could not answer, and that the questions were interesting enough to justify the discomfort of going underground to pursue them. The geologist Catherine Marsh, who first documented the Wiltshire chalk modifications in the 1990s, began her career working on aquifer systems. The underground was her professional medium. She spent years in it, mapping and measuring and sampling for reasons that were primarily economic and resource-focused. The underground as an archaeological environment was not what she went in looking for. It was what she found, and when she found it, she was careful enough and curious enough to document what she found rather than dismissing it as an anomaly outside her professional competence. That care and that curiosity produced the finding that has become one of the foundation stones of the case we have been building in this account. The caving community has provided many of the underground researchers whose findings have contributed to the broader picture. Cavers are, as a group, people who have developed a relationship with underground environments through recreational exploration rather than professional research. Their expertise in underground navigation and their accumulated knowledge of the cave systems they explore are real expertise, as rigorous and as practically valuable as the expertise of academic researchers in their own domains. When cavers find archaeological material in the course of their exploration, the quality of their documentation varies, but the finding itself is no less real for having been made by someone whose primary motivation was exploration rather than research. The documentation of the Yorkshire cave deposits and the Perthshire souterrain network and the Pembrokeshire sea cave and many of the other underground findings we have discussed in this account involved cavers as well as formal researchers. The collaboration between the caving community and the academic archaeological community has been productive at specific sites and in specific regions. It has not been as well organized or as well funded as it could be. The institutional structures that would support a more systematic collaboration between cavers and archaeologists in the investigation of Britain's underground have not been developed to the degree that the potential of the collaboration warrants. This is a genuine opportunity. The caving community in Britain is substantial, organized, safety-conscious, and deeply knowledgeable about the underground environments that it explores. Academic archaeologists who want to investigate underground features need access to those features and the knowledge of how to navigate them safely. The caving community can provide that access and that knowledge. Academic archaeologists can provide the research framework and the analytical tools and the institutional connection to funding that are needed to translate underground findings into properly documented and properly interpreted contributions to the scientific record. The combination is powerful. The institutional structures to make it routine are not yet in place. Building those structures is one of the practical priorities for the investigation of Britain's underground that the current state of the evidence most clearly demands. Not a research program focused on any specific site or region, but a collaborative infrastructure, a set of relationships and protocols and funding mechanisms that would allow the knowledge of the caving community and the expertise of academic researchers to be systematically combined in the investigation of underground archaeological sites across Britain. A structure that would make the individual, ad hoc collaborations that have produced significant findings in specific cases into something more systematic. Something that could cover the full range of underground environments and underground findings that Britain's geological diversity and its long history of human underground engagement have produced. The structure does not yet exist. Its creation would require the engagement of the relevant academic institutions, the national archaeological bodies, the funding organizations, and the representative organizations of the caving community in a collaborative planning process that has not yet been initiated. But the evidence for the need has been building for decades. The individual findings that demonstrate the potential of systematic underground investigation, when that investigation is conducted with appropriate expertise and appropriate resources, are now numerous enough and significant enough that the case for the infrastructure is strong. Someone will make that case effectively. The evidence supports it. The timing is right. And the underground of Britain, which has been accumulating evidence of the human past with the patience of geological time, is ready for the investigation that the infrastructure would enable. While that infrastructure is being built, the individual investigations continue in the chalk and the limestone and the sandstone and the granite, in the collaboration between the caving clubs and the university departments and the professional archaeological units and the heritage bodies that manage specific sites, in the slow and methodical accumulation of dates and deposits and tool marks and passage dimensions that is the currency of the underground archaeological record. Each investigation adds to the picture. Each finding adds to the pattern. And the pattern, the broad and deep and extensive pattern of deliberate human underground engagement with the geological landscape of Britain across spans of time, that the conventional model has not fully accounted for, is becoming clearer with each edition. The picture now shows, with confidence that grows as the evidence accumulates, an island whose underground has been as fully human, a landscape as its surface for as long as human beings have been on it. An island whose communities across all the relevant periods possessed and used and transmitted knowledge of the underground that is reflected in the features they created and the activities they conducted below ground. An island whose underground tradition was organized and sustained and sophisticated in ways that have implications for the understanding of prehistoric social organization, that the conventional models are only beginning to incorporate. This is the picture. This is what the scientists found in the tunnels beneath Britain, and this is why the world has been shocked. Not by magic, not by aliens, not by lost civilizations of impossible sophistication that the consensus of archaeologists is suppressing for unknown reasons. By evidence. Real, physical, datable, reproducible evidence of human beings doing things underground in Britain that the conventional framework for understanding Britain's past did not predict and is still working to fully accommodate. The evidence is the finding is the shock, and the shock is the beginning of a better understanding of what this island is and what its human story has been. A better understanding that will continue to develop as the investigation continues and the evidence continues to accumulate, and the synthesis that will make the full picture visible is slowly, methodically, and rigorously built. The underground of Britain is real. Its archaeological record is real. The tradition it preserves is real. And the scientists who have gone into it and found what they found have done work whose significance will be recognized more fully as the broader picture becomes clearer. Work that has advanced the understanding of one of the most significant and most persistent questions in British archaeology. The question of how deep the human story on this island really goes, and how much of that story has been hidden. Not by suppression or conspiracy, but simply by the darkness and the depth of the places in which the evidence was preserved. The darkness is not dark anymore. The scientists have brought lights, and what those lights have revealed in the passages and the chambers and the modified geological features of the ancient underground of Britain is extraordinary. Take it with you as you sleep. The depth beneath you, the age of the stone, the tradition that goes back further than any story we have yet been able to tell. And the scientists who are down there even now, in some cave or chalk passage or souterrain network or sea cave, with their equipment and their notebooks and their sample bags, adding another piece to the picture that will eventually show the world what Britain truly is: deep, old, full of the evidence of a human past that the surface alone was never able to contain, and extraordinary in every dimension of that word, above the ground and below it, for as long as human beings have been on this island, which is longer than we thought, and deeper and more remarkable and more fully human than the surface story has ever managed to show. The tunnels are there, the scientists are finding them, the world is being changed by what they find, and the underground of Britain, patient as the stone it is cut from, continues to give up its secrets to those willing to go down and look. One finding at a time, in the dark beneath Britain. This is the story, and it is real. Let us speak now about time in the way that the underground of Britain forces you to speak about it, not in the units of years and decades and centuries that conventional history uses, in the units of geological time, in the units of the processes that created the underground features before anyone went into them. The chalk of southern England was deposited over a period of roughly 35 million years. The limestone of Yorkshire began accumulating roughly 350 million years ago. The sandstone of the English Midlands is older still, deposited in Permo-Triassic desert conditions 250 million years before the present. These are not human timescales. They are not the timescales within which the human tradition of underground engagement operates, but they are the timescales within which the geological substrate of that tradition was created. When you go into the chalk passages of Wiltshire and you run your hand along a wall that was modified by human hands 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, you are touching a surface that was created by the dissolution of rock laid down tens of millions of years earlier. The human modification is the most recent event in the geological biography of that surface. It is the most recent entry in a record that goes back incomprehensibly further than any human activity. And yet, it is the entry that matters for the purposes of this account. The entry that represents the moment when the geological history of the formation intersected with the human history of the landscape and became part of the story that we have been telling. This intersection is one of the things that makes the underground of Britain a particularly powerful environment for understanding the deep human past. In the underground, the human past and the geological past are not separate. They occur in the same material. The human modification is in the rock. The rock contains the context for the modification. The geological biography of the rock and the cultural biography of the people who modified it are a single interwoven record that the careful investigator can read as a combined narrative. Reading that combined narrative is the skill that the scientists who have found things in the tunnels beneath Britain have had to develop. It requires geological expertise, the ability to read the rock and its dissolution features, and its stratigraphic context with the precision that distinguishes natural from anthropogenic modification. And it requires archaeological expertise, the ability to understand human material culture and its chronological signatures and the behavioral patterns that specific kinds of material remains imply. It requires both simultaneously, in the same person or in the same team, working together in the same underground space where the geological and the archaeological are inseparable. This is genuinely difficult. It is the difficulty of an interdisciplinary problem in which the disciplines must operate in an environment that neither, individually, was fully trained to work in. Geologists are trained primarily for surface and subsurface work, related to resource extraction and environmental management. Archaeologists are trained primarily for surface sites and the excavation of soil contexts. The underground, where the geological and the archaeological are interwoven in limestone and chalk and sandstone formations that required both geological and archaeological expertise to properly investigate, is a domain that demands the combination of both and has not always had it available in the required form. The researchers who have made the most significant contributions to the investigation of Britain's underground past have generally been people who developed this dual expertise through long experience in underground contexts. They are the researchers who recognized early that understanding what they were looking at underground required more than either their geological or their archaeological training alone had given them, and they developed through practice and through collaboration the combined expertise that the underground demanded. They are an unusual cohort, not large, distributed across several disciplines and several institutions and several decades of work. They do not always know each other or know of each other's work because the publication record of their findings is distributed across geological and archaeological journals and conference proceedings and heritage authority reports that do not naturally cross the boundaries between disciplines. The synthesis of their work is beginning but is not complete. When it is complete, when the findings of the geologists who documented dissolution features, and the archaeologists who excavated souterrains, and the cavers who explored deep cave deposits, and the engineers who encountered pre-Roman underground infrastructure, are all brought together in a single synthesis, the combined picture will be more remarkable than any individual component, because the individual components, each significant in their own right, are pieces of a larger pattern whose significance becomes visible only when the pieces are assembled. The assembly is the project, the investigation of Britain's underground as a unified tradition rather than as a collection of separate specializations in different geological formations in different regions, is the project that the accumulation of individual findings over decades of separate work has made necessary and possible. Necessary because the pattern is now visible enough that its significance demands the unified investigation. Possible because the findings that establish the pattern exist in the literature, however distributed and however partially communicated, and can be recovered and synthesized by researchers willing to do the work of bringing them together. That work is happening. It is not yet finished. But the direction is clear and the endpoint is visible. The unified investigation of Britain's underground past as a tradition that extends across geological formations and cultural periods and the full geography of the island will eventually produce the comprehensive picture that the individual findings have been pointing toward. The picture of an island whose underground was fully inhabited by the human past for as long as human beings have been on it, whose underground features preserve a record of that inhabitation that is more complete and more detailed and more ancient than the surface record alone, whose underground tradition was sophisticated and organized and sustained across spans of time that exceed what the conventional models for the relevant periods have been built to accommodate. That is the picture. That is the finding. That is what the scientists have been discovering, piece by piece, in the tunnels beneath Britain. And when the picture is fully assembled and presented to the world in all its complexity and all its depth, the shock will be not merely the shock of individual discoveries, but the shock of the whole, the shock of seeing for the first time the complete underground past of Britain laid out in its full extent and its full sophistication. The shock of understanding that this island has always been larger and deeper and more fully human than the surface story could contain. The shock of history revised at the most fundamental level, not the revision of specific facts or specific dates, though those revisions are part of what the evidence demands, but the revision of the framework itself. The expansion of the conventional picture of Britain's past to include the dimension that has always been there, beneath the surface, waiting, in the chalk, in the limestone, in the sandstone, in the granite, in the dark of the tunnels that run beneath this ancient island, where the past has always been, and where the scientists who go down to look are, one finding at a time, bringing it back into the light. That is the story. That is the finding. That is why the world has been shocked. And that is the understanding that will keep growing, deeper and more complete and more extraordinary, with every finding that the investigation produces. For as long as there are scientists willing to go into the tunnels beneath Britain and look, they will always be willing, because what is down there is worth finding, worth the effort and the discomfort and the methodical, careful work of reading the combined geological and human record that the underground preserves, worth the years that the investigation takes and the limited resources it too often has to work with, and the institutional resistance that contested findings in contested frameworks always generate. Worth it, because the truth is worth it. And what the underground of Britain has been preserving, in its chalk and its limestone and its sandstone and its granite, is the truth of the deepest past of this island, a truth that the surface was never going to be able to fully tell, a truth that only the underground can tell, a truth that the scientists who went into the tunnels found there, in the dark, patient and real and waiting, and that the world, receiving it, is finally beginning to understand. This is the story of what scientists found in the tunnels beneath Britain. This is what has shocked the entire world, and this is why the investigation continues. In the dark, beneath the surface, in the extraordinary, ancient, fully human underground of this remarkable island. Good night. The tunnels are beneath you. The past is in them. And the story they tell is as deep and as old and as extraordinary as any story that this island, or any island, has ever had to tell. The last question worth asking in this long journey through the underground of Britain is the question that makes all the specific findings meaningful in a way that goes beyond the academic. It is the question of what the underground tradition of Britain tells us about the people who created it, not in terms of their organizational capacity or their geological knowledge or their cosmological framework, all of which we have discussed, but in the most fundamental terms. What kind of people were they? What did they care about? What motivated them to go underground, generation after generation, across spans of time so long that no individual life could encompass more than a fraction of the tradition's duration? The underground requires commitment. It is not a casual environment. Going underground in the chalk or the limestone without modern lighting and modern navigation equipment requires courage, practice, and a confidence in your spatial memory and your knowledge of the specific underground environment that only long experience can build. The people who regularly went into the underground features of Britain were people who had learned to be comfortable in environments that most people, even in modern times with modern equipment, find challenging. They were people who had been trained into that comfort by a tradition that valued the underground engagement enough to teach the next generation how to do it. What that tradition valued, what motivated the teaching and the going in and the investment of labour in the underground features, was presumably what the underground offered. The practical things we have discussed, the water and the storage and the mineral resources, and the other things, the cosmological things, the things that the underground environment specifically enabled in ways that the surface did not. We can infer some of these from the pattern of where the underground activity was most intense and from what was done there. The astronomical alignments of certain underground features suggest that the underground was a medium for experiencing the cosmological order of the universe in specific and precisely timed moments. The deposition of human remains in underground contexts suggests that the underground was the appropriate domain for certain aspects of the relationship between the living and the dead. The manufacture of specific objects in specific underground chambers suggests that the act of making those objects in the underground context was part of what made them what they were. These are the fragments of a cosmological framework that we can infer from the physical evidence without being able to reconstruct the framework itself in any complete sense. The framework is gone. What remains is the evidence of its expression. But the evidence of the expression is enough to tell us that the people who created it were people for whom the world was organized in ways that gave the underground a specific and significant place. A place worth returning to, worth teaching others to access, worth investing in and maintaining across generations of community life. This is a kind of relationship with the world that most modern people do not have. The relationship with the underground that the communities of prehistoric Britain maintained was not incidental or occasional. It was part of the normal structure of how they understood and engaged with the world they inhabited. The underground was a dimension of their world in the way that the sky was a dimension of their world, present, significant, requiring specific knowledge and specific practices to engage with appropriately, rewarding that engagement with things that the surface alone could not provide. Understanding this does not require romanticizing the people who created and maintained this tradition. They were not more spiritual or more connected to the earth or more in harmony with nature than any other human beings. They were human beings, with all the complexity and the contradictions and the mixture of practical and symbolic motivations that human beings always bring to their activities. What they had, that most modern people do not have, was a specific relationship with the underground of the landscape they inhabited that was built on long experience and sustained by a tradition whose depth matched the depth of the underground features it was engaged with. We have lost that relationship. We have lost the knowledge that built it, and the tradition that sustained it, and the cosmological framework that gave it meaning. What we have left is the physical evidence of the relationship, the features that the relationship produced. The chalk passages and the souterrain networks and the managed spring sources and the deep cave deposits and all the other traces of the underground engagement that this account has been describing. Those traces are the gift of the past to the present. They are what the underground of Britain has preserved for us, across the spans of time since the tradition that created them was disrupted and eventually lost. They are the evidence from which, with the tools of modern science, we can recover enough of the picture to understand something of what the tradition was and something of what it meant to the people who maintained it. The scientists who have gone into the tunnels and found those traces have been recovering the gift. They have been doing the work of reading the evidence and constructing from it the picture of what the tradition was and how deep it went and how extensive it was across the geography and the geology of this island, and the world that has received what they found has been changed by it in the way that genuine recovery of a lost story always changes the world that receives it. The change is not complete. The recovery is not finished. There is more to find. There is more to understand. The full picture is not yet assembled, and the full implications of what it will show when it is assembled are not yet fully visible. But the direction is clear. The shape of the picture is emerging, and what it shows, with increasing clarity and increasing confidence as the evidence accumulates, is extraordinary. An island, ancient, deeply inhabited in both its surface and its underground dimensions, by communities whose knowledge was extensive and whose organization was sophisticated, and whose relationship with the geological landscapes they inhabited was three-dimensional in a way that the surface-focused conventional account of Britain's past has never been able to fully capture. An island whose underground tradition is as old as its human occupation and as extensive as its geological diversity. An island that has been keeping its deepest secrets in the dark for a very long time. The scientists went in to find them. They found what was there. The world was shocked, and the understanding that is being built from the finding is one that will, when it is complete, show this island as it has always been, in all its depth, in all its complexity, in all its extraordinary age, an island whose past is bigger than the history books have yet been able to contain, and whose underground, patient and complete, and full of the evidence of the longest human story this island knows how to tell, is finally beginning to give up what it has been keeping. One finding at a time. In the tunnels, in the dark, beneath Britain. This is the story. This is what scientists found. This is why the world has been shocked. And this is why the investigation will continue. And the understanding will deepen. And the picture will become more complete. And the world will continue to receive, with the appropriate shock of genuine discovery, what the tunnels beneath Britain have to tell. The tunnels are real. The findings are real. The past is there, in the dark, patient and extraordinary, and waiting for the next scientist who goes in to look. Sleep now. Let the depth rest beneath you. Old and real and full of what we are still learning to properly see. In the chalk, in the limestone, in the dark of the extraordinary, ancient, fully human underground of Britain. Good night, and good luck to the scientists who will go down again tomorrow. Consider for a moment the scale of what we have been discussing, not in terms of the specific findings, which are remarkable enough in their own right, in terms of the cumulative implication of those findings when they are all held in mind at once. The chalk passages of Wiltshire, potentially 8,000 or 9,000 years old. The Yorkshire cave deposits from the same period. The Perthshire souterrain network. The Welsh deep cave burials. The Great Orme copper mining. The Mendip spatial analysis. The Orcadian underground. The managed spring sources of Hampshire. The sandstone features of the Midlands. The submerged coastal sites of Pembrokeshire and elsewhere, the London gravel deposits, all of these in a single island, all of them pointing in the same direction, all of them together constituting a body of evidence whose collective weight makes the conventional picture of Britain's prehistoric past genuinely insufficient. The insufficiency is not a small insufficiency. It is not a matter of adjusting a date here and revising an estimate there. The underground evidence, taken as a whole, demands a picture that is qualitatively different from the conventional picture in at least two fundamental respects. First, in its temporal depth. The conventional picture of organized human landscape modification in Britain begins with the Neolithic, roughly 6,000 years ago, when the construction of the first monuments and the beginning of agriculture represent a step change in the scale and the organization of human engagement with the landscape. The underground evidence pushes this organized landscape engagement back to at minimum the Mesolithic, 3,000 to 4,000 years before the Neolithic monuments, and possibly earlier. This is not a small revision. It changes the starting point of the story by a third or more of its current acknowledged duration. Second, in its spatial comprehensiveness. The conventional picture of Neolithic and Bronze Age landscape modification in Britain focuses on the surface monuments, the henges and the long barrows and the cursuses and the stone circles. These are the recognized features of the recognized cultural tradition. The underground evidence suggests that those surface monuments are the visible component of a landscape modification program that also had an underground component. That the people who built Stonehenge and Avebury and the Ness of Brodgar and the passage tombs of the Boyne Valley were not simply engaging with the surface landscape, but were engaging with the full three-dimensional landscape, surface and underground, above and below, in ways that the surface-focused archaeological record has never been able to reveal because the underground component was, by its nature, not visible from the surface. These two revisions to the temporal depth and to the spatial comprehensiveness of the organized human landscape engagement in Britain are not minor adjustments to the conventional picture. They are fundamental expansions of it, expansions that make the picture more complex and more accurate and more fully expressive of what the evidence, all of it together, actually says about the deep past of this island. The scientists who have been building this expanded picture have been doing so incrementally, one finding at a time, without always being able to see the full picture that their individual contributions are building toward. The synthesis that would make the full picture visible has not been produced, but the evidence that would support the synthesis is there. It is in the literature. It is in the archives. It is in the ground beneath Britain, still waiting to be fully recovered. And the synthesis, when it is produced, will be among the most significant contributions to the understanding of British prehistory that any generation of researchers has made. That is the significance of what scientists found in the tunnels beneath Britain. Not just the individual findings, which are each significant in their own right, but what those findings add up to when they are brought together. What they collectively imply about the deep past of this island and the communities that created it. What they reveal about a tradition of underground engagement that was as old as the human occupation of Britain and as extensive as the geological diversity of the island. What they demand in terms of the revision of the conventional picture to accommodate the evidence that the underground has been preserving and the scientists have been recovering. The demand is real. The evidence supports it. The revision is necessary, and it is happening, slowly and methodically, as real revisions in real science always happen. Through the accumulation of evidence and the honest assessment of what that evidence means, and the gradual, sometimes reluctant updating of frameworks that were built before the full evidence was available. The frameworks are updating. The picture is expanding, the understanding is deepening, and the world that is receiving the findings, piece by piece, is being changed by them, in the way that genuine discovery always changes the world, by showing it something true that it did not see before. This is the story of the tunnels beneath Britain. This is what the scientist found there. This is why the world has been shocked. And this is the story that will continue to develop in the dark beneath this ancient island for as long as the investigation continues and the evidence continues to arrive and the picture continues to grow more complete. It is a long story. It goes back a very long way. And it is still being told in the tunnels by the scientists who go down, in the findings that come back up, and in the understanding that those findings are building one discovery at a time toward the full truth of what this island is and what its past has been. Beneath the surface, in the dark, where the oldest chapters of the longest story Britain knows how to tell have been waiting, patient as chalk and stone and limestone, for exactly this moment. When the scientist went down to look and found what was there and brought it back to a world that needed to know. This is what they found. This is the shock. And this is the story that is still being written, in the tunnels beneath Britain, by every scientist who goes in to look, and every finding that comes back out, and every understanding that deepens as the picture grows more complete. The tunnels are real, the past is there, the finding continues, and the world, receiving it, is changed. In the dark beneath Britain, where the story lives, and where the scientists are going, still, to bring it home. The closing thought deserves to be about what it feels like to stand at the entrance of one of these underground features and know what is inside. Not all of what is inside. The full picture is not yet visible, and the full contents of the underground of Britain have not been fully recovered. But enough. Enough to know that what is inside is ancient and real, and the product of deliberate human engagement with the underground landscape, across spans of time that exceed comfortable comprehension. Enough to know that the people who created what is inside knew what they were doing, and did it for reasons that made sense within their framework of understanding, even if that framework is not fully accessible to us now. Enough to know that the investigation has only begun, and that what remains to be found is more extensive and more significant than what has been found so far. Standing at the entrance of an ancient underground feature in Britain with that knowledge is a particular kind of experience. Not dramatic in the way that public accounts of archaeological discovery tend to be dramatic, with the sudden opening of a sealed chamber and the first light falling on undisturbed ancient material. Quieter than that, more like the experience of looking at a long sentence in a language you are still learning to read. You can see that it is saying something, you can make out some of the words, but the full meaning is not yet available to you. It requires more study, more time, more practice with the language before the sentence will yield what it contains. The underground of Britain is a long sentence in a language that the scientists have been learning to read for decades, and that still yields its full meaning only partially and gradually. Each finding adds another word to the available vocabulary. Each synthesis adds another grammatical rule to the understanding of how the words connect to each other. The sentence is becoming more readable, not quickly, not completely, but genuinely and progressively more readable. And what it says, as more of it becomes legible, is extraordinary, in the way that long and patient and methodically earned understanding is always extraordinary. Not flashy, not dramatic, but deep, real, and profoundly significant for anyone who cares about the truth of what this island is and what its human story has been. That is the reward of the investigation, not the dramatic single discovery, not the moment of sudden revelation, but the gradual deepening of understanding, the slow assembly of the picture, the progressive realization that the island is larger and older and more human in its underground than the surface story has ever been able to show. The understanding that grows deeper with each finding and that will continue to grow deeper for as long as the investigation continues. The investigation will continue. The scientists will keep going down. The findings will keep coming up. The picture will keep growing more complete. And the world will keep being changed by what the tunnels beneath Britain have to tell. This is the story, this is the finding, this is the shock, and this is the extraordinary, patient, deep, and fully human underground of Britain, telling its oldest story, to the scientists willing to listen, and to the world that is, at last, beginning to understand what it is being told. Sleep now, with the depth beneath you, and the knowledge that the story is still going, down in the dark, in the tunnels, where the past has always lived, and where the scientists are bringing it home, one finding at a time, patient as chalk, old as limestone, extraordinary as the full human past of this ancient and remarkable island, which is older than you thought, and deeper, and more fully human, and more extraordinary than the surface alone has ever been able to show. Good night. The underground of Britain is beneath you, and it is real. There are people alive today in Britain who know things about the underground landscape of this island that the scientific community does not know. Not in all cases, not uniformly, but in specific places and specific communities, knowledge of underground features has persisted in forms that are not fully captured in any academic or governmental record. Local farmers who know about passages beneath their fields, communities whose oral traditions reference underground features with a specificity that implies real geographical knowledge, people who have been underground in specific features and who have not reported what they found because they did not know who to report it to, or because they did not know that what they found was significant, or because they had reasons to keep the knowledge within the community that held it. This distributed, unformalized knowledge is a resource, not a comprehensive or reliable resource, but a resource that the scientific investigation of Britain's underground has not systematically engaged with. The systematic engagement would require going to the communities and the individuals and asking, carefully and respectfully, and with the appropriate framework for understanding what the answers would mean. It would require developing the relationships and the trust that allow people to share knowledge of places they know and care about with researchers whose institutional affiliations and research intentions are not always immediately obvious or obviously beneficial from the perspective of the communities whose knowledge is being sought. This is slow and careful work. It is the work of ethnographic method applied to geographical knowledge rather than to cultural practice. It has been done, partially, by folklorists and local historians and the occasional archaeologist who understood its value. It has not been done, systematically, at the scale of the full underground tradition of Britain and with the specific focus on underground features that the broader investigation demands. But the knowledge is there, in the communities, in the people who live on and with the land that holds the underground record, in the traditions that have persisted, imperfectly and partially, but really, through all the changes that have disrupted the more systematic knowledge of the underground that the ancient tradition once represented. Finding that knowledge, recovering it from the communities that hold it, testing it against the geological and archaeological record to evaluate what it can contribute to the understanding of the underground tradition, is one of the remaining tasks of the investigation. It will not be the easiest task. It will require the right people, with the right relationships and the right framework for understanding what they find. But it is a task whose potential return, if even a fraction of the distributed community knowledge of underground features in Britain, corresponds to real and significant features that the scientific record has not fully documented, is substantial. The investigation of Britain's underground is many-layered. It is the geological investigation of the natural and modified features of the relevant formations. It is the archaeological investigation of the material culture and the datable deposits associated with those features. It is the historical investigation of the documentary record of encounters with underground features across the centuries of recorded history. It is the ethnographic investigation of the folk traditions and the distributed community knowledge that has preserved, in various forms, information about the underground landscape. And it is the scientific synthesis that brings all of these together into a picture that is more complete and more accurate than any single approach alone can produce. The synthesis is the goal, the investigation is the path, and the underground of Britain, patient and deep and full of what the investigation has so far only partially recovered, is the subject. A subject worthy of the full investigation it demands. A subject whose importance for the understanding of the deep human past of this island and of the human past, more broadly, is large enough to justify the sustained commitment that the investigation requires. A subject that the scientists who have been going into the tunnels and finding what is there have been advancing piece by piece, toward the understanding that the evidence supports and that the world needs to have. That understanding is coming, one finding at a time, in the tunnels, in the dark, beneath Britain, where the past has always been, and where the scientists are going still, to find what is there, to bring it back, to tell the world, and to change the understanding. One discovery at a time, for as long as there are tunnels to enter and findings to make, and a world willing to receive what the underground of Britain has been keeping for exactly this long. This is the story, and it is real, and it continues.